Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. This is Danny Haiphong, your host for another live stream, a special Saturday live stream. We have a great show today, so be sure to hit that like button as you come onto the stream. That helps boost this stream in YouTube's algorithm. We have a lot to get to, including everyone is right now anointing Israel victorious. We will discuss with our special guests today exactly what that means, if it is true or not, and we will discuss actually what is going on the ground militarily, geopolitically, in West Asia. We will also get to this burgeoning EU energy crisis as Ukraine turns off the spigot of Russian gas. We'll talk about the implications of that and so much more as the desperation begins to mount in Kiev. But with all of that said, let us get to our first guest today. He is a decorated colonel, former colonel. He also served in the U.S. State Department under Colin Powell. He is a returning guest. He's a friend of the show. That is Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. Thanks so much for joining me again.
Thanks for having me, Danny.
Of course, of course. So I wanted to first talk to you about what's happening in West Asia. So where do we even begin? We've seen almost daily strikes, hypersonic missiles fired into Israel by Yemen's Ansar Allah, the Houthis, as they're called in Western mainstream media. Back in December, Larry, we saw that Yemen claimed, the Ansar Allah movement claimed that they downed an F-18 U.S. fighter jet in the Red Sea. They've also said that they have fired on U.S. aircraft carriers, naval aircraft carriers in the Red Sea as well. Now, everyone's claiming that the resistance is dead right now, Larry, but I'm curious, what do you make of Yemen's response to this over this time as they also, the Yemeni people, demonstrate in the streets of hundreds of thousands, if not more than 1 million people in solidarity with Gaza?
Frankly, Danny, the Yemenis seem to me to be irrepressible, inexhaustible, and incredible. They just don't seem to be able to be beaten other than a land invasion by several powers or a nuclear attack. They seem incredibly able to adapt, and they always have. Let me paint a little bit, we're talking West Asia, but let me paint a little bit of a tapestry that I think I have woven over the last 2 or 3 years, going back to my notes with my students and notes I took when I was chief of staff at the State Department and elsewhere, starting really with a shock when I read George W. Bush's 2002 National Security Strategy, a public document, not classified. And that strategy essentially said, anyone who rises even imperceptibly at the bottom of our mountain, we will smash with sanctions, with military power, or with both. And increasingly now, we will use our allies as proxies to do so. So I began to ask myself, why is this such an adamant position taken by clearly an administration that had provocation of 9/11 and other things, but more or less molding itself into what I've been seeing going on since World War II as a professor of that period. And I've come to the conclusion, and I'm trying to put this in a little bit more of a concrete format, but it basically says in 3,000 years of human history that we know most about, the incredible power in the world, if you will, political, cultural, informational, intelligence, military, all the elements of power we like to classify today belong to the East. And the sucking mechanism, if you will, the supportive mechanism, the cashier of that power was China. We like to forget that today, of course. They don't forget it. And I've been in their Central Party school. I know they don't forget it. What's happening today is after that power for 3 millennia lingered very powerfully and for a long time in the East, In about 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella started some navigational exercises we all know about, but most Americans haven't a clue as to what they really meant. That shifted or began to shift that power majorly. Europe was already trying to shift it, but it was not being very successful. What comes out of the New World, if you will, is the rape, pillage, and plunder of entire civilizations in North, Central, and South America at unbelievable, fathomless wealth characteristics. I mean, Spain was so rich, it ruined its guilds, its business guilds. It didn't need business anymore. It was so filthy rich. So the Spanish Empire grew, the French Empire grew, and most of all, the British Empire grew to be that one which had a motto that the sun never set upon it, which was preposterous. It certainly did. But it was one of the largest in terms of earthly expanse empires that the world had seen in all those now some 4,000 years. Well, along came America in 1945, and a unique empire was born. An empire that did indeed span the entire globe, that created military fiefdoms for the entire globe, put a 4-star general or admiral in charge of each of those fiefdoms, and most of all, invented by stealing the world's scientists and some of its own nuclear weapons. No empire in history, none, period, zilch, ever had the capability to destroy the human race as a riposte to its diminishment in power. Mogul, Mongol, Ottoman, you name the empire, Eastern or Western Roman, none of them could do this, certainly not the British. We can. What are we looking at today? We're looking at a massive countershift. The power, political, cultural, informational intelligence is going back to the East, with China as a powerful magnet sucking it back to the East. 1 in 5 on the world surface is a Chinese. 2 in 5 is a Chinese or an Indian. 3 in 5 is an Asian. This is inexorable, and we're fighting it tooth and nail in this belt of chaos that we're creating from the Baltic to Chabahar and Bandar Abbas at the southern end of the Persian Gulf is our attempt to arrest this shift in power. And Israel is not a product of the Jewish lobby, as Mearsheimer and Walt say. I'm convinced of that now. They're our attack dog. They're doing precisely what the empire wants them to do in Southwest Asia. And as long as that goes on, they can probably seem themselves inexhaustible in carrying out what we want them to do. But I think it's going to end. And I think it's going to end abruptly for this attack dog. And here's something people don't understand. We will cut that dog loose as fast as greased lightning if we have to. If it becomes inimical to this interest to stop this power shift, we'll cut Israel loose. And I think it might be getting close to that point where we cut them loose.
Yeah, well, that's why I wanted to start with Yemen in this region, because as you've talked about, Larry, this region of West Asia is so critical to cutting off the rise of this new world. And Yemen and Ansar Allah are seen as very small players in this regard, but they made themselves very, very big over the course of this last year, taking this, even in this moment of declared victory for the empire, what I call a temporary reprieve, they've continued their strikes on Israel. And we also have seen, Larry, that Israel itself is still in the best shape. We have reports of suicides way up in the Israeli Defense Forces. We also have reports that still there is no end in sight to what's going on in Gaza, not only because Israel wants to destroy the entire place, but also because Palestinians are fighting back. What's your take on this narrative then? Because a lot of people are saying the opposite of what you're saying, that Israel's end is actually nowhere near in sight anymore, especially after the fall of Syria.
Those are all good points, but I think they are generated chiefly by the propaganda machine that First Jerusalem has, which is unsurpassed. It's just pure lies, but they propagandize those lies really effectively. And the propaganda machine that the empire has, which has a lot more territory to concentrate on, if you will, than Israel. Netanyahu the other day talking about how little Israel was and putting the maps up. I wanted to say, you little son of a bitch. Of course you're little, but look what you've got behind you. You've got the American empire behind you with 750 military bases in the spans of the world and nuclear weapons. So the propaganda machine of Israel is just unmatchable. But the empire does a pretty good job too. And you've got situations now in this country where my people, whom I talk to on a daily basis, sometimes question the things that people like Scott Ritter, Doug McGregor, and I and others say, and they don't know what they're talking about, and they don't know what they're talking about. You parse it closely with them because they're getting their information from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and a host of other media outlets in this country that are wholly owned by the empire. That's the problem in this country in terms of getting the word to average Americans. Once you get an average American down who has even a modicum of common sense and maybe a little education, and you talk to them seriously about the situation, you can get them to begin to think and to begin to question what's happening. But it's tough. You've got to almost go one at a time. So as long as these propaganda machines exist and are fueled with the huge amounts of money, one thing I didn't point out is watching all of this shift, this power shift, watching all of it as the Rothschilds, for example, watched it in a previous century, as J.P. Morgan watched it in a previous century. All of these people, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Group, they have names now, are already relocated almost completely to Davos, and they will relocate to capitals in the new powers of the world when they feel it's necessary. So watch those financial capitals and those financial people and what they do and where they go and where their money winds up, because that's the real teller of when this shift is taking on unstoppable dimensions. And I think that's what we're seriously worried about. And our debt does not give us at all a high ground to stand on to do this.
Larry, you have military expertise. You've been inside of the belly of this beast that we are talking about. And one thing that I've noticed that most people aren't talking about, if we just even center on what's happening in West Asia, there's a lot of now enthusiasm on the part of those players you just named within the empire about what's happening there. But still, you have the US's top attack dog in what they still acknowledge is an endless war with all of these problems that haven't changed just because, let's say, Syria fell. Israel actually continues to extend itself further and further. It is now fighting a so-called adversary thousands of kilometers away in Yemen, which has shown for over a decade to be able to take the bombardments, the airstrikes that the US, UK, and Israel now have laid upon
Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Yeah, exactly. The entire
all backed by the US.
Right. So talk about these. Could you talk about this, because you've talked on other programs about these actual challenges that I think are in contradictions and I think signals toward the end of the empire, especially in relation to Israel's own condition.
I think the Yemenis are a good place to start, because if you look back over history, you know, the 3,000 years that we know quite a bit about, and even the 2,000 and the 5,000 that we don't know a lot about, but we have a lot of conjecture, especially from archaeologists and people like that. If you look over it, you have people like the Yemeni. You have people who, for example, take on the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, people like Vercingetorix and others, who play an incredible role in hindsight in bringing the end of the empire. And that might be the Yemeni's role right now, is to be, as I said, irrepressible and inexhaustible and just keep on fighting and fighting and fighting. I have no doubt, really, as a military professional who went to the Naval War College, who taught at the Naval War College, who has put this forward to his colleagues in the Navy for 2 decades now, that they're going to take out an aircraft carrier. Now, it might not be the Yemeni, but I put my money on them first and foremost right now, as long as we're not in a formal war with China, who will take out all of our aircraft carriers, probably in the first 90 days. And that's going to be, for the American people in the empire, a truly traumatic experience. The American people haven't been at war since 1865. Not really. World War II was fought over there, thank you very much. They have not seen this kind of thing in their lifetime, certainly, and even in their grandchildren and grandfathers and, great-grandfathers' lifetime. They haven't seen this sort of thing. 100,000 casualties in a 10-day period, maybe 250,000 in a 10-day period, except we can't put that many troops in the field, Navy, Air Force, or otherwise, to get them killed. But the carrier goes down, it's 5,000 souls. It's the entire air wing. It's $16 billion. And I would say there will be more than one if we get in a conventional war with China or Russia or both of them together, or even Iran. Should the Houthis do that? Watch out for what we do back to the Houthis. Watch out for a land invasion that would then probably keep going into Iran. Now, the counter to that is what I'm hearing, and I'm hearing it from good sources, that the Iranians feel like, some of them anyway, that they're in such a pickle right now that they have opened secret talks. I assume they're secret, probably through Oman or Qatar or someone like that. I would vouchsafe Oman, and because they seem to be really good at offering good offices for really intractable problems, and we're working on a nuclear deal. And they are anticipating Donald Trump being the person to come in and, with a little truculence and a little bombast, at least maybe give them a deal that might lift some of the sanctions, which are, as with Syria before, doing a lot of damage in Iran. So that could throw a wrinkle into that if the Iranians are suddenly working with the empire and are not there to continue to support the Yemeni, because probably a precondition of the deal, one of them, would be that they stop their support for the Houthis. But I think that would be just temporary, because this is too volatile, and just if Israel is our attack dog, Israel will always keep the place roiled up, because the empire thinks confusion is conducive to this arrestment of power shift. Confusion and chaos, I should say. You could call it the C squared, confusion and chaos. That's what we're doing in Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Romania. That's what we're doing in West Asia and the Levant. And Israel, our attack dog can have Lebanon, it can have Gaza, it can have parts of Egypt, it can have Jordan, ultimately. If I were the king of Jordan right now, I'd be sweating bullets.
Larry, do you think that Ansar Allah, the Houthis, that they downed the F-18 fighter jet reported in December?
I looked into it as far as I could. My contacts aren't as good as they used to be, but I thought it was maybe a Vincennes type incident. You remember when Vincennes, 88, I think it was, shot down the Iranian Airbus in the Persian Gulf. The CIC got Combat Information Center, Command Information Center got confused, and at least that's what the record seems to reflect, and shot down and killed 177 Iranian civilians, as I recall. So it's not impossible that we could have shot the aircraft down ourselves with a confused CIC, especially if a lot of missiles were coming in and such. But the more I look at it, the more I think the Houthis might be truthful, that they actually shot the aircraft down. And of course, the empire wouldn't admit it.
And right now, the situation in West Asia, it has that look to it that you have just described. Everyone right now is anointing Israel essentially invincible. They've expanded into Syria. Iran is, as you said, regrouping and looking toward possible negotiations to ease its own situation. At the same time, though, you had Iran's supreme leader talk about how a lot of these, the axis of resistance has its own domestic capabilities. And Hezbollah, even though after the ceasefire, there's been this narrative spread that Hezbollah was defeated, Hezbollah is saying through Sheikh Qassam that after the 60-day ceasefire, it is very possible that there is a resumption of the armed resistance to Israel, given the violations and given all the indications that Israel has no intention of letting Lebanon alone. So what do you make of this overall situation for Israel? Like, do you see, you've made the point many times that, Israel is in a lot more dire situation than maybe is led on in the mainstream media. Do you see that continuing here forward into 2025 as the 60-day ceasefire in Lebanon stops, as Yemen continues its strikes on Israel, and as, of course, there are talks, and there will be talks, it seems like in 2025, of possible attack on Iran, as these recent Biden leaks seem to indicate.
I'm reinforced majorly in my view expressed over the last 8 years, particularly over the last 2 years, that Israel won't be a state in a very short period of time. The attack dog will be cut loose by the empire because it will become too costly to maintain it. Part of the reasons I say that are what you just suggested. There are tactical and operational reasons to suggest that. There hasn't been a ceasefire with Lebanon. Israel has violated the ceasefire every day. The only reason they quieted down and agreed to, quote, a ceasefire, unquote, was because we asked them to help us with Syria. And Turkey concurred. So they had to divert a few forces and, we can take lots of the Golan that we don't presently have? Let's go. So they got this ceasefire going, but they never stopped killing Lebanese every single day, or bombing this or bombing that every single day. Not as extravagantly as they were bombing Syria, for example, but they never ceased fire. Hezbollah did, to a certain extent. A few people crossed here, crossed there, giving the Israelis their excuses for violating the ceasefire. But Hezbollah needed the time to rearm and re-equip, and probably to retrain some people. They've learned some things with regard to how they pretty readily defeated the Israelis in their incursion. Not quite as effectively as 2006, but they did, I think, achieve more success than the Israelis did against them. They want to repeat that and deepen it and amplify it. So they need a lot more to do that with. And I'm being told now by some reliable sources that they have reestablished a line of communications, line of contact, line of support, whatever you want to call it, LOC, LOS, military terms, so they can get supplies. And I've been asking the question, is it maritime? Because I'm really worried about the submarines the Israelis operate in the Eastern Mediterranean. They would take those ships out in a heartbeat. We have a phenomenon right now, Danny, of ships all over the world. Don't talk about the Russian secret fleet as those mighty, powerful military giants the Baltic states do, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Don't talk about the secret Russian fleet. Talk about the secret U.S. fleet. Talk about all the steamers and ships in the world that are going around with all kinds of cargo that have Lloyd's of London, for example, putting their agents in ports with clipboards, trying to figure out if the ship coming into port at that moment is one they've got insured and take them to task for turning their transponders off and so forth. So I'm sure that if they have a maritime connection for new missiles, ammunition, and such, that it is probably running around with its transponders off too, just as the Iranians are, just as the Russians probably are with oil, just as others probably are with oil too. By the way, all the JP-8 that Israel is getting that it needs for these massive airstrikes, other than the 300,000, I think it is, barrels a day, and that's not very much when you think about 20,000 going one flight, that they can refine, is coming from ExxonMobil. Good old ExxonMobil shipping it to Israel. Is it going there on U.S. flagships? No, probably not. Is it going on tram steamers with, how is it going there? This is part of what I say that the empire is going to have to take very close scrutiny of as Israel gets deeper and deeper into the problems. And they are in deep problems. Yeah. They have massive problems in the IDF, morale problems. They have people not showing up. They have AWOLs. They have AWOLs, absent without leave, just taken off. They're losing people. I'm told it's somewhere around 750,000, maybe even 1 million that they've lost already from Israel. It's no longer a safe haven. How can you get up in the morning when the Houthis can hit your airport and you say, well, I came here for a safe haven. This is no longer a safe haven. And they have some tremendous problems with their ego. Their ego puts them down there around Quneitra now, and even further south into Syria. It puts them, as you said, attacking the Houthis with these strikes, attacking Syria from one end to the other with airstrikes. I called the IDF a bunch of cowards the other day. I don't know what else you can call them, because they do this. They destroy civilian infrastructure. They kill civilians, babies, women, and everything. And they're immune to danger themselves. They're like the B-2 pilot. B-2 pilot who wrote an article about flying to Baghdad. What to pack on the way to Baghdad was what he called it. He said, I am invulnerable. I am going to drop 2,000-pound satellite guided bombs on the Dora farms, hopefully to decapitate Iraq before the war ever starts. And I'm invulnerable. Am I a warrior? Well, the IDF ought to be asking it that question every day. Am I a warrior? I'm killing people, and I'm absolutely immune to anything but a maintenance failure. This is horrible what's going on. And we're training people to be this way. But as you intimated, and as I'm saying, this is taking a terrible toll on that professional force that the Israelis think is second to none in the world. It is rapidly becoming second to a lot, and maybe third or fourth, because it's falling apart with its. What do you say about it? It's called good order, discipline, and morale in the U.S. Armed Forces, and good order, discipline, and morale is tattered, frayed, and falling apart in the IDF. I think it's only a matter of time until this starts really showing up on the battlefield, and probably unbeknownst to these theoretical tacticians running around the world, it might happen first in Gaza, because that's where they're supposed to be invulnerable in terms of winning. And they haven't won a damn thing. They haven't satisfied a signal objective.
No, and what I often, and I want to hear your expertise on this, Larry, because you are much closer to military circles than I. But when I look at the situation, I think to myself, Israel can destroy a lot of people's lives, murder a lot of people, commit genocide. But when it actually has to fight, it cannot do that. It is not capable of winning the fight that it says it has already won, that they're already saying they've beat Hezbollah, they've beat Hamas, they've beat the resistance in Palestine, they've beat Iran. But what I see is that they are not fighting anybody. In Syria, they've been bombing, but there was no fighting. The government fell without fighting, and
Right.
Israel has taken advantage of a situation. To me, that's not strength. That is a product of circumstance. Now they're saying they're going to decimate the Houthis, Ansarallah, in Yemen. But the United States, the UK, Saudi Arabia, they've been trying to do that for over a decade and have not succeeded. And Israel has already made mention. A lot of their think tanks, even Daniel Hagari, their spokesperson of the military, says, "Oh, this may be more difficult than we might be letting on." So, Colonel Wilkerson, are they just not fighting anyone? Is this just the overall circumstance that they find themselves in? Because it seems like the Palestinian resistance, even we hear every day in Gaza, they're still fighting. They're still, they have, regardless of what people might think about the weapons, how they're going to arm themselves, what the future is. I just read that Israel is saying that it is the resistance is too big to get rid of. You basically have to kill everybody because everybody is with the resistance. Your thoughts?
And every time you kill someone, especially a woman or her children, you create 5 more. No question about it. That's the phenomenon of this sort of war. And if you don't understand that phenomenon and do something to accommodate it, you're going to lose. And you're going to lose strategically and big time, which I think is why Israel is going to lose. But let's parse it a little more closely in terms of military operations. What I see is a tank commander down around the southern end of the Galilee Sea, the Sea of Galilee, and out a little into Syria, around Quneitra, that area, the Wada Dam and so forth, driving his tank up to a Syrian Arab who doesn't even know he's Syrian, probably. I mean, he's right there on the border. He probably trades, as my son said when he was monitoring for the Air Force, the Syrian-Iraq border. He said, "Dad, I look at that border every night through sophisticated mechanisms. I look at it every night. The only thing happening down there is illicit trade." That's what happens. And they don't know that they belong to any state entity. They're just interested in profit, illicit profit. That's about the only kind they can get. So you look at that and you say, okay, he's driving this tank up to this Arab chieftain, actually. He was in charge of the area around where the tank was. And he says to the guy, and this is on Al Jazeera, he says to the guy, in essence, in Arabic, he says, "This is mine now. It's not yours anymore." And the guy looks back at him. He's some sort of mayor or council chairman, a council chairman, something. He looks back at him and he says, "This has been my land for so many years, blah, blah, blah. No, it's not yours anymore. It's mine. See that tank? It's mine." Well, this is Israel. This isn't fighting. This is using the empire and its might to tell people they are being dispossessed of their lands, their orchards, and ultimately their lives. And that's how Israel operates. If someone comes up against them, and here's as a military professional, I won't say I would love to see it, because I don't want anybody getting wiped out the way I think this would happen. I would love, though, to see the Israeli tank commander do the same thing to a Turkish tank commander who had an entire platoon or company or maybe a battalion of tanks behind him, and get into a scrap. The Israelis would run like chickens with their heads cut off. I guarantee you, because they haven't seen real combat in decades, really since the 73 war. They have not seen real combat. Excursions here with Hezbollah, this, that, and the other thing, and mostly occupation duty. I guarantee you they would turn around and run. But I would love to see this demonstrated to the world so that we could get a little bit of better picture of this undauntable military that Israel feels. And that would happen where they encounter the Turks and the Turks be serious about it. A real army, well equipped and willing to stand their ground. That could happen, yet. The problem with that, or the challenge for that happening, to more or less teach them a lesson, I'm not sure what kind of lesson it would be in the long term, though, because the empire is still going to be behind them, and would, if it came to it, probably put its own troops on the ground there, and that would be the end of the empire for sure, if we put troops in the Levant with Israel with intent of staying there and fighting everybody, including the Houthis. That'd be the end of it. I mean, the unraveling would go a lot faster if we did that. But if it were to happen, it would happen around the arrangements that I understand were made. The Turks and us made an arrangement that the Turks would be allowed to do certain damage to the Kurds, that we would be allowed to seem to protect a certain element of the Kurds. And here's the footnote there. The only reason we're doing that is not because we're beloved of or love the Kurds, just as in Iraq when we abandoned them. It's because they're protecting our some 2,000 to 3,000 troops and equivalent number of contractors in Syria who are stealing Syrian oil and shipping it to Israel. So this is the agreement, and this agreement could fall apart at any time, and suddenly the Israelis would be confronted by a real army. That'd be interesting to see as a military professional. But those are the kinds of explosive things that we've created there now.
Yeah, and a recent report that's going across Western mainstream media is that the United States has been considering attacks on Iran's nuclear sites over this last period, if trying to escalate with Russia in Ukraine to the point of possible nuclear confrontation was not enough. There has been, according to reports, Jake Sullivan and Biden having deep talks about this. So my question to you, Larry, is what would happen to Israel and the United States? Because it's obvious that Israel is in this long war with many, many fronts that doesn't seem like it's going to end anytime soon. But the United States, when it comes to this larger proliferation, which seems to be much closer than it ever has been in West Asia, it will include the United States in a deep way. What would happen if the United States were to actually confront Iran, which is a big dream for many of those in the Washington foreign policy establishment right now?
You know, Danny, I think that's the one disconnect that I can detect between the cognoscenti, if you will, in the empire. It's hard to define them sometimes, from Lindsey Graham to Tom Cotton, to whomever you want to name, and Israel. That Netanyahu's ardent desire to have the United States take care of Iran for him is a point that the empire is not willing to go to yet. Witness the fact that we're, I think, trying to effect a new JCPOA, if you will. And the reason for that is because we know, And our military has advised president after president, at least 3 of them, 4 of them actually, counting H.W. Bush, that it would be tantamount to defeat were we to put ground forces into Iran. And one even used the expression that I use sometimes: you like Iraq, you'll love Iran, because it'll be 10 years, $10 trillion, and you'll have enormous casualties, and you will not have subdued the country, which is so much vaster than Iraq, so much more populated, 26, 27 million versus 90 million, so much more homogeneous, 51, 52% Persian, just a different ballgame altogether. We would lose, in other words. In long terms, we would lose. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to expose that kind of vulnerability in that spot at this time. And so presidents have been talked out of it and have become adamant about not wanting a war with Iran that we have to participate in. Here's another factor. Now, remember, I was there in 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, and from roughly August of 2002 to January 2005, Powell gave me the North Korean portfolio. So I'm with EAPR, East Asian Pacific Region of State Department, and the CIA and others almost every week in working groups and such. And we're watching closely through the most sophisticated national technical means we have. And I'm telling you, we're looking at photography that you could read the North Korean soldier's name. We're 24/7 doing this. And all of a sudden, the Koreans have a nuclear weapon. It would not surprise me at all if Iran has a nuclear weapon already. They did it underground. They did it almost exclusively underground. And we were watching them the whole time. And they still had a nuclear weapon. When Kansak-ju and Ye-gun looked at Jim Kelly and said, when he was telling them, here's an economic package, we'll trade you for stopping your nuclear program, reprocessing, and all, they looked at him and said, we already have weapons. You could have knocked Jim Kelly over with a feather. I'm not so sure that isn't the case. So another reason why not to do it is to start a nuclear war in the Levant.
Yeah, and there's both that risk as well as you've been detailing, there's huge problems militarily trying to take out Iran, especially given the fact that any kind of war with Iran, Larry, would also, correct me if I'm wrong, include everybody else that Israel and the United States has been waging war against, whether it's the Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen, whether it's Hezbollah. Everybody would be compelled to get involved, and that would create so many problems. Maybe your final word on this.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think in the reverse, if you will, China and Russia would use that to do to us what we're using Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova to try to do to Russia, or they'd enter it. I mean, this is truly a game stopper, I believe, for this power shift. Which, and I didn't say this, but I'm going to say it. This is basically a China leading this power shift, causing it to happen like a magnet that really doesn't want war. That wants the inevitability of this power shift to slowly and surely take place, and wants the other empire being diminished to accept it and to continue to operate, for 100 years or so. We can still trade, we can still be competitive and all that, because they don't have the same attitude about it that we do. They're not bellicose about it. Sergei Lavrov said it the other day when he was describing Xi Jinping to someone who asked him a question. We're to Chinese a bunch of, and he's, I don't find them that way. I don't find them that way at all. That was not just tactically diplomatic. That was the truth. I don't find them that way either. And I've been in China off and on since 1984. So yeah, if they thought that the United States was serious about putting roadblocks in their way that would be unstoppable or insurmountable, they'd enter it reluctantly, but they would enter it, and they'd beat the bejesus out of us. But then we would go nuclear. That, again, that's what scares me.
Yeah, I mean, you have Russia and China with deep relations with Iran. They view West Asia as incredibly important to their overall
We
strategic
forget it is Asia.
future.
It
Yeah,
is
it's
Asia.
Asia. It's incredibly important to their overall development. And both Russia and China understand that the United States has been talking about toppling all of these unwanted governments in order to get to Russia and China, in order to isolate them and then to move the conflict there. Now, a lot of people, Larry, are saying that, well, Russia and China are just waiting around. The Iran is Iran going to go the way of Syria because it's now just kind of hanging back and allowing everything to go on. What do you make of these narratives? I think there's a lot of pessimism right now because of the overall situation, understandably so. But I'm curious about your thoughts of the accuracy of this. Is it that Iran is being too strategically patient and is lending itself to its defeat in the long run, i.e., like Syria?
I think Iran's principal concern, and this ranges from the new president to Zarif, who probably knows us better than anyone else in Iran today, to the leadership of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, to the Guardian Council. I think this is a thought that permeates the whole place. There are different inflections on this thought. They do not want war with the United States. And they realize, I think, inchoately, if not with clarity, this power shift that's taking place. And they realize where the engine is, or the engines, really. We've not even talked about Indonesia, Malaysia, and a host of others who are doing quite well. Thank you very much. And they don't want to be the fly in that process that causes it to arrest itself for 100 years or maybe permanently, because we'll eliminate ourselves with nuclear weapons, or we'll eliminate enough of human civilization that will stop progress for at least 500 years, such as it is. And then you got climate change to worry about too. And by the way, a nuclear exchange would exacerbate climate change majorly. There's some really good analyses on that, some done by the military. So Iran is in a hard place right now, just as I think Russia is. You know, if you think about this geopolitically, Russia's in both worlds, both the West and the East. It's always been there. When Catherine made her whole court have to speak French, and all diplomacy around Catherine was conducted in French, John Quincy Adams, as a 14-year-old boy, was there. And John Quincy will come back when Alexander takes over as czar, when Catherine's dead, and John Quincy will know more about that Russian court than any other American diplomat. It was rumored, for example, that we knew more about Napoleon's movement because one of the Adams was there at the court of the Russians and got all the information than anybody else in Europe. And it's probably true. We did know more about what Napoleon was going to do the next day because we had really talented people in Moscow. So Russia's stuck in both worlds. And that's both an advantage and a disadvantage. And we're seeing the disadvantage right now as she tries to reach to China. At the same time, she blessed for being in Europe. And of course, most of the geographers put, if not all of them, put Russia in Europe, at least from the Urals to the west. So she's got a real hard decision to make. First, how fast is this shift happening? Second, do we go with it tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, or whatever? And how do we go with it? And that's a tough decision, especially when you're buried in this stupid war in Ukraine.
Yeah, and I think we could make that case for all of the powers we just spoke about, Iran and China
Yes.
too. It is a decision. How fast can you accelerate toward this new world that is being born versus how much do you have to contend with and continue to navigate the challenges that a dying empire brings, which we are seeing are really grave challenges, like
Yes.
entire humanity ending possible challenges with nuclear war. And I think that sometimes what gets me is when events happen, I think Americans especially, and people in the West especially, tend to look at things with a very short view, that this is what has happened, and
Tomorrow morning. Yeah.
we've concluded Iran is done, Russia is in trouble, China's in trouble, the resistance in West Asia is dead. Look at how neutralized it is. Israel's on the rise. Look at Turkey now. I have my doubts about Turkey's superiority myself, but it seems like everybody is on the bandwagon of Turkey is now this
Well,
big rising power.
I didn't mean to suggest that the Turkish military was absolutely superior. I was more saying the IDF is inferior.
Yeah, no. But what I'm saying is that with what happened to Syria, they didn't even fight anybody then, and yet now they're being anointed because they've taken more territory. They're getting ready to slaughter what had been partially U.S. proxies for so long, the Kurds. That now Turkey's looking like people are saying, "Oh well, Turkey. Look at Turkey. They're now a rising power." And I still don't. I'm with you, Larry. I don't believe that Israel or even Turkey really do anything without the United States' express, not just approval, but of course, assistance and wink and a nod. When that wink and a nod goes, in my opinion, that all falls apart. There's
well, you could yeah, you're right. You could put Ankara in the same boat I just put Russia to a certain extent. Strategically, geopolitically, they've got a decision to make too, and Erdogan seems incapable of making it. Even though the EU has stiffed him now for 20 years, he seems incapable of making it. He hints at it all the time, but he never does anything.
Right, and what he does do is the abhorrent, right? Like the talking about Gaza, not doing anything about it.
Exactly.
Talking about becoming a country in the multipolar world, and then going to Russia and saying, "Hey, actually, we're going to we're going to be a big part of overthrowing a government in Syria that you are very close with, and we don't care. We don't." So, but maybe in the last remaining minutes, Larry, we can talk about Russia and Ukraine moving into 2025. We just had the gas being turned off by Ukraine to Russia from Europe, and there's just so many things happening. You also had 8 ATACMS launched at Russia just in the last day or so. So I'm curious, Larry, where is this conflict going into 2025 for you, given your assessment of forces, especially on the military end, if you could comment, because I think a lot of people are looking at Vladimir Putin's patience, his reactions to things like the ATACMS strikes into Russian territory as being too patient, not firm enough. But is there something that we should know about where Russia is at militarily in this conflict that may help people better understand?
Well, as Sergei Lavrov has made quite clear, the ATACMS, and from a military point of view, he's absolutely right. They don't do much at all. They have too short a range. Russia's 11 time zones. I mean, this is a very short range missile, about 300 kilometers. It's the political thing that bothers Sergei, and it bothers Putin. And the political thing is it's NATO doing it, and they know it. They know positively the intelligence and the operation on the ground takes NATO help, probably U.S. help. And that's a provocation. And were it me, and I'm not as smart as Putin, but I probably would have put some sort of high-velocity missile into a NATO target in Poland or something like that, just as a response, just to show them that I was serious. I think he's more prudent than that. He's more circumspect than that, and he knows he's winning, and that's the ultimate thing. They so decimated this NATO-trained brigade that went in there, just tore it apart. I understand the commander was fired. The battalion commander that was elevated committed suicide. They lost something like 1,700 troops in 20 hours. This was stupid. It was idiotic. But again, it was the empire using its proxies to piecemeal itself on the battlefield in Europe, here in Ukraine. Just a disaster, though. And the Russians are taking so much territory every day now that if we don't get to negotiations by 20 January or shortly thereafter, they'll be just short of Kyiv at the rate they're moving. they're taking so much territory and there's no one there to defend it. And these attempts like this are just preposterous and just get people killed. This lowering the draft age is the same kind of measure. It'll just get people killed. As to the pipelines, this is really interesting for me. I've got to try and ferret this out if I can with my intel friends. They were getting huge transshipment fees, probably some of the best hard currency other than the US Treasury and the European Treasury. Kind of like the North Koreans were getting so much hard currency from counterfeiting our bills at that time, 20, 50s, and 100s. And when you cut off hard currency like that, that makes operating on your level of luxury a little difficult for these oligarchs. So why did they do that? Obviously, as these other moves are, I think it's a last-ditch effort to try and hurt people and get them to support you better on the one end of the coin, and on the other to hurt Putin. But I don't think it can last very long, because there are going to be powers in the world that don't like that. And those powers are BlackRock, Vanguard, State Group, the ones who really orchestrate this. So I don't look for that to even begin. And if it does begin, I look for it to end fairly swiftly. And that may be something Trump can claim as a victory. You know, I got that settled. After all, we did ruin Germany by taking out Nord Stream.
Yeah.
Can you
yeah.
imagine that? I mean, if I were the German chancellor,
the elephant in the room that continues to, I think, shape, or yet it's ignored, just this, seems to be another suicidal policy, which is what Ukraine just did, obviously at the behest of its masters.
Yeah. And the Baltic worries me too, because those little powerhouses up there, the Baltic states, are talking about intersecting, interfering with, maybe even boarding, maybe even searching these secret fleet ships of Russia. There's only two reasons you can do that: slavery and piracy. And it's neither. So they'd be violating international law, but they think they can do it. And of course, we carried out the maneuvers. Remember, on Kronstadt and St. Petersburg, we carried out maneuvers that looked like they were aimed at invading those two key portions of Russia, which are very vulnerable. And Putin knows that. But the Baltic states aren't going to take them. I mean, this is the Baltic states. I've been in Riga. They are. Interpol will tell you that their claim to fame is trafficking in Eastern European women and narcotics, and they're members of NATO.
Yes, they are. They are. They're the members of NATO, also right on Russia's border, which of course is the another big issue. And they talk a lot. Yes, like Estonia, for example. Big mouths, perhaps big bark, little bite.
One of my Polish friends who's in Warsaw said, you know, those little pups, they ought to be smacked. And then he said, and we should be smacked too.
Well, you know, it's an interesting phenomenon, because these states are essentially fake states. They were created right after the fall of the Soviet Union, and they have taken up exactly the kind of character you would expect, as you describe them, a pup, the characteristics of an attack chihuahua, so to speak. What do you make, Colonel Wilkerson, of the numbers that we're hearing about desertions in Ukraine's military? There's a number upward of 200,000 now. Your reaction to this development?
I don't see how you could arrest it, really, because the pace of the Russian juggernaut now and the efficiency and effectiveness of it is so clear and so damning in terms of your life if you're on the front lines or even near them. They're murdering the people in the Kursk salient. They're just tearing them up from every angle and with every weapon system you can imagine. They're just murdering them. They're either going over to the Russians, because the Russians have a very good campaign going. And the campaign is, you hold your hands up, chuoi, as we said in Vietnam, surrender, and we'll take care of you. And they are living up to that promise by and large. They're taking care of them, feeding them, and giving them warm clothes and so forth. Sometimes they don't have either on their side. And others are running the other way. And some are running all the way as far as the border and crossing into other countries that are having a real problem right now with the increase in refugees in there. And Poland is one in case that they have plenty already, they say, and don't want any more. So it's just disintegrating. And the only thing hiding that disintegration really is our propaganda.
Indeed. Colonel Wilkerson, it's been great to be with you today. Do you have any final comments on the state of Ukraine and the conflict before you depart?
Only that we need to stop it. And if Donald Trump doesn't stop it, then, we are probably doomed to a low-key burning war for another 3 or 4 years and killing people every day, killing Russians and killing Ukrainians, probably 5 to 1 on that basis, or maybe even 10 to 1. But the Ukrainians were great partisans. They robbed everybody. They shot everybody. They raped anybody's women. They're great partisans. You didn't want to go into Ukraine, one German told me, a Russian told me the same thing. You didn't want to go into Ukraine because you'd go through the woods and they'd jump on you. And, so that Putin doesn't want that. He does not want the whole of Ukraine because he would have that kind of situation on his hands. But we could well make that happen.
Yeah. Colonel Wilkerson, I look forward to our next conversation. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Yeah, take care.
Bye-bye. I won't say Happy New Year because I don't think there's any prospect there.
It's going to be a bumpy ride indeed.
Yeah.
Take care. All right. Well, next up, without any delay, it is Mark Sleboda, international affairs expert, military affairs expert, geopolitical analyst. Mark, it's great to see you again.
Danny, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show. And following up, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson is a tough cross to bear. So my thoughts and prayers are with myself following him up.
Well, I, for one, am very happy to force you to bear this cross because it's always great to talk with you. Now, where do we even begin, Mark? How about we begin with Ukraine? How about we begin with, there's more ATACMS being launched at Russia. We have Donald Trump coming very soon. Russia, Putin, they are vowing that there's going to be a response to this. But then you have just story after story of Ukraine's utter deterioration, whether it's the desertions, the low morale, the fact that these ATACMS are about to dry up. I believe they just use 8. That would leave them with, 42 left if I'm doing rough estimates. So, Mark, how about you give us a rundown of what the state of this conflict is as we enter into 2025?
Okay, so let's start with where we are today first, because the Kiev regime / NATO just launched large long-range strikes on both Belgorod, which is already a long-suffering city in that regard. 8 U.S., the Biden administration fired 8 U.S. ATACMS ballistic missiles into the Russian city of Belgorod. And, the Western media will use these weasel words and terminology like allowed the Ukrainians to fire when we know perfectly well that this is an American weapon targeted with American satellite data, with that targeting data programmed into the missile to be fired from an American military specialist on the ground, right? And we know that because no less a purser than the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, outright admitted that. He says when justifying his reason not to send Taurus cruise missiles already a year ago, he commented that, the British to fire their Storm Shadows, the French to scalp the Americans, their missiles, they have to have people on the ground to do it, and I don't want to put people on the ground. And we've heard also the same from German generals who were plotting to blow up the Crimean bridge with Taurus cruise missiles and leaked audio. They also said, well, maybe we could get the Americans. They're already on the ground. They're firing, or the people with American accents is the euphemism they used to fire the German missiles as well. So this is a Biden administration ballistic missile attack, not the first one. Right? I think we're on the fourth salvo. Now, the fact that all these missiles were brought down tells us, one, that Russian electronic warfare and air defense have developed a very effective profile and have proved very effective at bringing these missiles down, right? It's the same thing with all of these U.S. GPS satellite-guided weapons, right? Whether we're talking the ground-launched small-diameter bombs or JDAMs or the normal HIMARS rockets, all of these weapons that they've provided to Ukraine, right? We saw the headlines in the Western media, U.S. high-tech weapons work against Russia until they don't, right? It's the Borg sequence from Star Trek, right? You get 3 shots with your phaser, and by then the Borg shields have adapted, and that's it. And obviously, wherever Russia has electronic warfare and air defense assets, they're going to be bringing down at least 7 out of 10 of these things. Now, what you can do is fire where there are no electronic warfare and air defense, but then it may not be as valuable a target either. I mean, Russia is a very big country to defend, but 500, the ATACMS range isn't all that. We also have reports, just as I was sitting down, of large-scale attacks on Crimea and Sevastopol as well, with British Storm Shadows and drones. And that may very well be both aerial and naval drones again as well. So, the long-range strike war continues. Now, Russia, nearly every day, whether we're talking long-range drones like the Garan or its significant quiver of missile strikes, whether we're talking cruise missiles or ballistic missiles or hypersonic missiles, Ukraine is pummeled on a much larger scale, much more effectively, because the Kiev regime has little to no air defense, right, at this point, that can resist Russia's attacks in any significant way. And, they always claim, we've shot down 105 out of 100 missiles. The one that got through just happened to hit 37 different targets. This type of, Baghdad Bob level propaganda that the Western mainstream media even seems embarrassed to regurgitate for us. So long range strikes continue. Significantly on the battlefield in the last week, Russia has essentially taken full control of Kharkiv. The Russian Ministry of Defense hasn't announced this. This was an important supply center behind the Kiev regime's defensive lines in the southern Donbass region. Right. First, there was the breakthrough of the defensive at Avdiivka, right? Almost a year ago now, and then the Ocheret and the Bloom. And then Russia has took Ugledar, the southernmost fortress city, Selidova, the southernmost of these supply centers. Now Kharkiv, and really the only significant urban area and supply center left is Pokrovsk, and Pokrovsk is very quickly being taken into pinchers now. And those pinchers will slowly cut off its supply lines and around Russia to move in from multiple sides. And Pokrovsk does not have very significant fortifications. So while it is a large urban area, I don't think that the defense of Pokrovsk will last as long as some people on the western side think it will. Turetsk and Chasiv Yar have been long, hard-fought battles, both of them, but both of them look like they're coming to an absolute end here in the next several weeks, month, two at the tops, and that's hanging on to a few outlying buildings in both cases at this point. Russian has over 90% of Turetsk, or the ruins of Turetsk, if you want to call it at that point. I think the significance of this, the Turetsk and the Karahava being taken, is that for the first time since 2014, the city of Donetsk was able to enjoy a New Year's free of artillery strikes. Right, the Kiev regime forces have now definitively. They were effectively, they already have been for some time as Russia was moving into Karahava and the surrounding area. But now, other than HIMARS, right, there is literally nothing within the Kiev regime's inventory that can hit Donetsk city. So the people of Donetsk city, long suffering under the Kiev regime's artillery, pedal mines, and everything else on a nearly daily basis since early 2014 or middle of 2014. That is now finally out of the artillery range of Donetsk city, which is an accomplishment. So the South Donbass continues to be, a story of Russia steamrolling and the Kiev regime unable to put up any significant defense. And the last places where they were able to put up a defense, Turetsk, Chasiv Yar are falling. Russia is also moving in on Seversk and making very substantial progress in the direction of Kupiansk, Liman, and the Zhurabets River area. Lots of progress there in the last few days. I saw a Ukrainian military lamenting that in the last month or so, Russia was taking 20 square kilometers of Kiev regime-held Ukrainian territory every day, and that's considering that Russia is still largely fighting a war of attrition, right? Capturing territory is still almost incidental. It's not what they're aiming for. And the other flashpoint is the still titanic battle. It's actually not as big as in terms of men deployed and everything, but in the Kursk salient, which is now pretty much reduced to a small pocket around the town of Suja. And Suja, before the Kiev regime's incursion, was a town of some 4,000 to 5,000 people, and that's the most significant urban area that they were able to take in this backwoods area that they launched this attack in. So the Kiev regime continues to throw reinforcements after reinforcements after reinforcements, not into Pokrovsk, not into Chasiv Yar or Turetsk, but into Kursk, into this death box in Suja. I have to assume that this is mostly for political reasons. I guess you could extend that into information warfare. But even with all the reinforcements they keep throwing in, Russia continues to advance. And the headlines have been grabbed in the last couple of weeks by the Western mainstream media, no longer really able to ignore the phenomenon of desertions within the Kiev regime's armed forces. Officially, the numbers are some 60,000. The Western media is talking 100,000. Ukrainian Kiev regime commentators are talking 200,000. And the real number is probably somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000. And some of this is gained by commanders not admitting when troops have abandoned their forces. Often they continue to collect the paychecks on behalf of those soldiers. And sometimes they even send them back to pick up 9-to-5 jobs. And then those people working 9-to-5 jobs send salaries, bribes basically back to the commander for not being at the front. But also, when they're referring to desertions, they've got two separate classifications of what amounts to, right? They use different acronyms, but AWOL, absent without leave, but is considered without the intention of permanently deserting. And then desertion, which is, leaving your positions without the intention to ever reserve. And of course, there's a huge amount of gray area between the two of them, and classifying a lot of people as AWOL rather than desertion helps bring the numbers down. So if you're wondering where this 1 million man army is on top of the deaths and the casualties, well, there's a huge number of desertions as well. But despite all of this, and despite the general trajectory on the battlefield, I think we need to have a serious look and understand that this isn't over yet. And all the indications is that the Kiev regime is about to launch another suicide offensive, or more than one. If you have been paying attention to their mobilization, despite the very large numbers of desertions they're suffering, and desertions even in NATO-trained Ukrainian forces. The 155th Mechanized has been reported in Bloomberg and other places in the last couple of days. And this was a force where a significant portion of it was being trained in France. And this is actually a problem because a lot of Ukrainian troops are sent into European countries to be trained, try to sneak out while they're there. They try to take advantage of the opportunity and desert while in NATO countries, which is one of the reasons why they're so eager to send troops to train Ukrainian troops in Ukrainian territory, because then they don't suffer desertion, and then end up with essentially refugees on their own territory. But the 155th Mechanized, by the time they were to be sent into, direct combat with their newly French-trained officer corps, they had suffered some 1,700 plus desertions, which is essentially half of their of a brigade, right, of their total fighting force. Despite all of this, they have conducted a large, what is euphemistically called mobilization campaign, right? Mass forced conscription with violent press gangs roaming the country. And if reports are to be believed, they've now stood up some 14 brigades. They have received very large amounts of Western equipment, ammunition, but also military equipment. That we last saw something approaching that, it's not quite the same extent, but we last saw something like that in the spring of 2023 before the big offensive in Zaporozhye. The U.S. has sent more than 200 Stryker vehicles, armored vehicles, and they have not shown up in any significant numbers on the battlefield in the months since they've been sent. The Australians have sent something like 50 older Abrams tanks. We've also seen large numbers of armored vehicles from Germany and other countries. These have, as far as I can tell, have not appeared yet on the battlefield. So, in an attempt to make some last-minute information warfare gains before Trump takes office on January 20th, to create facts on the ground going into what they believe will be negotiations and a ceasefire. The Russians have no intentions in that regard at all, but that's seems to be what they're counting for. But also, I think, considering that morale is a problem, and this is a double-edged sword, and there may be arguments that, well, if we show that we're back on the offensive and fighting and taking territory, then people might be less willing to desert. On the other hand, there's a lot of people who have seen how well that worked out in Kursk. But there are very large buildups of Kiev regime forces in several areas. And there are 4 potential vectors for this Kiev regime offensive. And it may be more than one, although at the end, I believe most of the forces will be diverted to one, and the others will probably be mostly diversionary. But there's 4 main regions where we can expect this sometime between now and spring, right? Where the height of winter is most like when this will be launched. But one is a buildup in the Sumy region towards Bryansk. And if you are familiar with the northern Ukrainian border with Russia, right? In the very east, there's 3 Russian regions that border Ukraine up there, right? The Belgorod region, where we've seen numerous attacks. That's where the ATACMS attacks were just in the last 24 hours. Then you have the Kursk region, where the current incursion is finally being, ground down and driven out now with this pocket around Suja. But to the west of the Kursk region, the westmost of these 3 regions is the Bryansk region. And there has been a very large buildup of Kiev regime forces on the other side of the border, and Russia has launched very heavy ballistic missile attacks, Iskander strikes, as well as artilleries into that area in the past few days. And likewise, the Kiev regime has also been conducting large-scale artillery attacks across the border. This is classic, artillery prep on both sides before a encounter battle, right? Before we can expect to see Kiev regime forces trying to cross the border and temporarily taking more Russian territory. However suicidal it might be, and strategically, I think it makes even less sense than the Kursk incursion would. But that's a possibility to look for. Another one is across in the south, in the Zaporozhye region again, but in the direction of the Kakhovka Reservoir, or what used to be the Kakhovka Reservoir. Because if you'll remember, some time ago, almost 2 years now, the Kakhovka Reservoir dam was destroyed, almost certainly by the Kiev regime. And now that ground is largely passable, and particularly in the height of winter, may be frozen and completely passable to even heavier weapons. And right across the Kakhovka Reservoir, or the former Kakhovka Reservoir, is, of course, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which the Kiev regime has launched multiple amphibious assaults on back when there was a reservoir, all of which dramatically failed, and that the Western media only admitted to like a half a year later. But they launched multiple such attacks across the reservoir, all in dramatic failure. But we may see a repeat of that again. And part of this is some type of, it is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, a very significant energy supply. It would help the Kiev regime with the electricity problems that they're having because of Russia's repeated missile strikes on the Kiev regime's electrical infrastructure. But also between Zelensky and particularly Budanov, the Kiev regime's military intelligence chief, seem to have a real, almost hard-on sexual obsession with the idea of taking a nuclear plant or some type of nuclear facility or armaments like tactical nuclear weapons, and possibly in the Kursk area, and using that as some type of blackmail or some type of false flag and catastrophic situation to try and once again drag NATO directly into the conflict. So that is probably the second most likely area. And once again, there is a buildup of Kiev regime forces there. There is a buildup of Russian forces, and there are artillery strikes and drone strikes to a greater intensity than we have seen previously happening there right now. The other two possible areas where a Kiev regime offensive might be launched is into Transnistria in Moldova. Moldova is a small country wedged in between Ukraine and Romania. It is a divided country with the easternmost region, Transnistria, being a separatist region of which there are small separatist region of which there have been roughly 1,200 Russian peacekeepers for, well, close to 2 decades. This all broke down as the Soviet Union was dissolving in the early 90s. So this has long presented a problem for Moldova. Moldova, once again, just recently re-elected a very pro-Western, pro-NATO president, Maya Sandu. Yeah, she got through by the skin of her teeth once again, but she will continue this agenda. She is fully bent on a Western course, and she, of course, wants to retake Transnistria. This has all been complicated by the Kiev regime's moves in the recent days to refuse to extend or renew gas transit contracts through Ukrainian territory, through the Druzhba Soviet-built pipeline into Europe. And all through this conflict, this has not been affected by Western sanctions because exemptions were created for it. The largest amounts of this gas goes to Slovakia, Hungary, but also Austria, Italy, and Moldova. And in Moldova, it goes through Transnistria. Now, with the refusal to renew those contracts on January 1st, Gazprom was forced to halt the transit of gas through Ukraine, which means they're no longer able to fulfill their contracts, although they're not legally responsible in this regard due to Ukraine stopping itself being a transit country. It has to keep in mind that Ukraine this entire time was drawing gas. It's for its own purposes off of those pipelines. Right. And it was collecting money for transit fees, significant money. Yeah. Right. So all of that is gone now. But perhaps the country most affected by this is Moldova. And Moldova has been entirely dependent on Russian gas for its energy supplies. Now, there has already been made emergency arrangements for, of course, far more expensive American LNG to be shipped up from Greece into Moldova. But of course, none of this gas is going to reach Transnistria, the separatist region. Why would they provide energy for that? So Transnistria is in an acute energy crisis right now. They're switching to emergency supply of coal. But right now, they're not supplying electricity except to hospitals and other emergency venues. It's already a humanitarian crisis in the middle of winter. And the supply of coal will last maybe 52 days as of a couple days ago, I think, right? Russia cannot supply reinforcements militarily or logistically to Transnistria at this point, to its troops there, to its peacekeepers, or to the people there, because it's completely isolated from this and it's, landbound. Russia can't get supplies in there. They would have to take Kherson, across the Dnieper, take Kherson City, Nikolaev, and Odessa, which on their own would be probably more than a year's worth of military campaign and, risking amphibious crossings and the like. So this is a very bad situation. And there have long been rumors that the Kiev regime may cooperate with Moldova and basically wipe out the Russian peacekeepers there and retake Transnistria for the Moldovan government in Chisinau. This is all the more complicated because in Transnistria is one of the largest Soviet arms and ammunition depots, perhaps the largest one, where almost all of the weapons that were withdrawn, weapons and ammunition that were withdrawn by the Red Army from the Warsaw Pact were dropped off in Transnistria. Now, a lot of these weapons are old, the ammunition, they haven't been well maintained, but beggars can't be choosers. And the Kiev regime, these would be far more effective in the Kiev regime's hands than Western weapons, right? Because they know how to use these. They know how to maintain them. They know how to refurbish them. They know how to use it. This is why in late 2022 and 2023, the Kiev regime was quite effective in using all of the Soviet legacy equipment provided by all of the former Warsaw Pact countries who are now members of NATO, like Slovakia, like Poland, like Hungary did not participate, but many others, Czech and many others did there as well. Now one can presume that the Russian troops, the Russian peacekeepers there, almost certainly have this thing wired to blow if it ever looks like the Kiev regime could get their hands on it, because it could sustain their war effort for, 2 years, maybe more, if they were to get a hold of it. But you have to presume that they have contingency plans in place as well. So this is quite a pickle. It is an intersection of this desperate search for some type of offensive that will break the Kiev regime out of the kill box they're in, because the way it's going, of course, with the war of attrition, they're just being ground down and there's nothing they can do. They're looking for a way out. They're looking for some type of way of changing or some type of black swan, effectively. And this ends up with an intersection of energy geopolitics, right? Slovakia and Hungary are, of course, furious at the Kiev regime. Slovakia is threatening to cut off electricity. The Slovak Prime Minister, Robert Fico, no friend to the Kiev regime. He survived an assassination attempt by a pro-Kiev regime radical, an extremist. And the Kiev regime has survived these Russian attacks on its infrastructure, largely because of energy being sent by Europe into Ukraine, electricity. And Slovakia has been the biggest provider of this, right? Hungary to a lesser extent as well. So it really seems like the Kiev regime is very eager to, cut off its own foot to spite itself here. But this is an angry little geopolitical hornet's nest of energy and separatist tensions and NATO aspirations of Moldova as well, or the pro-Western factions within Moldova. Moldova is a very divided society, right? If you put Transnistria back in, it's split 50-50. If you take Transnistria out, which politically it is right now as a separatist region, then it's 55 pro-Western, 45 pro-Russian. You see how this is all rather complicated there. But there are other separatist regions in Moldova as well that or potential separatist regions. The things could go very south in Moldova. And of course, this would be a very big horizontal escalation and expansion of the war into another country, right? We've already seen this conflict to some degree extend into Africa and into Syria, right? With the Kiev regime supporting Al-Qaeda, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which recently overthrew the Syrian government, supporting Islamist rebels in the Sahel. But this would be a major escalation beyond that, right? And this would be another European country, and it would lead to renewed cries that Russia is trying to, bent on aggression and expansion and creating some former Soviet Union, when in reality this is all being provoked and escalated by the Kiev regime and NATO. So this is another potential vector for offensive to watch for in the next few months, and it's such a political energy, geopolitical hornet's nest. Everything's wrapped up there. The other the other potential is another attack in the Belgorod region. We've seen multiple of these Russian neo-Nazis that fight for the Kiev regime attacks there. The Russia Volunteer Corps and the Free Russia Legion, which are just, even the New York Times admits, outright flaming Satanist neo-Nazis, right? So we could see a renewed offensive there, perhaps by the Kiev regime military. And there's always the outside chance of another potential escalation and expansion by going for Belarus. Belarus is in the heat of a, quote, election campaign where the Belarusian president / dictator for life, depending on your reading of it, everyone's favorite curmudgeon, Alexander Lukashenko, who is affectionately known in this part of the world as Batka, which is like saying uncle.
Right.
So he is, quote unquote, running for president again, and you can be sure that there is the potential for another regime change effort, perhaps to be dovetailed into a cross-border excursion there. Despite the fact that Russia has recently officially thrown a nuclear umbrella and said that it's going to be Lukashenko with Oreshniks as well and everything else, but they consider Belarus to be vulnerable, right? Perhaps in the same way that Syria was vulnerable, right? To not a direct military assault, but to some type of hybrid warfare. So lots of possible vectors. And I would suggest that you'll see something kicked off in more than one of those areas in the next few months. But then the majority of the effort will be funneled into one of them. Much like the way Russia arranges now for multiple possible vectors of attack, and then they make the final decision, largely depending on where the Kiev regime puts its own defensive units, where opportunity arises. Because, with satellite coverage, with the amount of intelligence on both sides, that's the way you have to achieve tactical and strategic surprise in situations like that. Is your force has to be like water. It has to be able to flow, and logistics are a big part of that. So you flow to where there's opportunity, to where the opponent hasn't enough defensive forces, and where units may desert or break away, or whatever situation evolves. But Russia could also very much in the next few months also launch their own offensive, perhaps in the Zaporozhye region towards Orehov as well. So we could very well see dueling new offensives open up in the next 2 months. This could be a very hot winter yet to come. And understand that particularly Russia, but also Ukraine, in this part of the world, the winter is not viewed as a time to take off and rest from the campaign and prepare for the new year. Winter is good fighting weather. Winter is when the ground freezes and these heavy vehicles can traverse fields and the like. It's spring and a wet autumn. Those are the bad seasons. Those are the mud seasons. And you'll notice that Russia hasn't slowed down for the last 2 mud seasons either. They keep going. They may focus on different things during those seasons, different types of attacks, but Russia's offensive has been essentially for a year now and hasn't really stopped. It's just picking up steam. But the Kiev regime is likely to get back in the game. Again, almost certainly the focus of this is to make some type of games for information warfare purposes ahead of what they think will be important negotiations, some type of deal pushed by Trump, to which the Russians have already responded, yeah, we have no interest in it. We have no interest in any ceasefire. Thanks. We've already presented our terms. If you want to talk about those, we're more than willing to sit down and talk with Trump or anyone else, Kellogg, whoever. But if you're not, then yeah, thanks, but no thanks. We're not interested. No. You're not a neutral party to this conflict. You are a party to this conflict, and you're on the losing side of this conflict. You don't get to present a deal to us. You don't get to present terms to us. Right? We present terms to you. That's where the Russians are coming from at this point. And they don't necessarily expect anything different from Trump than from the Biden administration, based on his last presidency. So that's where things are right now. Everything is going Russia's way on the battlefield right now, but watch out for that curveball. There's going to be a curveball coming in the next few months. The Kiev regime, the West, is not done yet. Trump may have some inclinations that he wants to de-escalate, but I guarantee you the blob, the deep state, the permanent bureaucracy, whatever you want to call them, they disagree. And all of their powers now will be bent to manipulating Trump to continue or escalating the conflict. And they've managed to do it before. He wanted to pull out of Afghanistan and Syria, and none of those things worked out really well during his first administration. And, Putin, he said no to your deal. He said niet. He is allied with the mullahs in Iran. In fact, he's just about to sign a new strategic partnership with them. And he's allies with the Chinese Communist Party in China. I wanted to be friends with Putin, but he allied with all of our enemies, and he didn't take my deal, and I had no choice. But what was that? What was that you whispered in my ear, Waltz? Oh, you need to escalate to de-escalate. You need to show strength if you want to have peace, right? This is the way it's all going to go down, more than likely. I hope I'm wrong, but then again, I don't do hope. And if I'm wrong, then I'll be very glad. But, look first for a Kiev regime surprise, however strategically suicidal offensive, or more than one in the next few months. And then look for not what some people may expect from the Trump administration going into next year.
Well, Mark, I think what you just said there at the end about suicide, how we're strategically suicidal, that's what I kept thinking about as you were describing the situation, is that there is something left for Ukraine to do, for the U.S. And Ukraine's paymasters to continue to do, but it all leads to what it seems like. It's like there's something left to do, but it leads in the same direction of the more you go, the more you lose. Does that sound accurate?
Yes, but that's not the way they look at it. Okay, first of all, they're still hoping that a renewed oil sanctions against Russia or new sanctions, or they're watching, the 23% inflation on some goods in Russia, and they're hoping that finally the Russian economy might be succumbing to their sanctions, right? I don't believe that's the case in the slightest, and I live here. But, for people who believe in hope, hope dies last. So one, they're counting on that. Two, they will always just pray for a black swan event. Maybe Putin will actually, who's been reported to be dying of everything under the sun in Western media, cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, heart attack, whatever you want, AIDS, COVID, Putin's got everything. Black plague, maybe. I don't know. Maybe Putin could die. Maybe they could kill Putin. Things can happen. So black swan event. The third is that far too many people think of winning and losing of a conflict like this as a binary situation, as some kind of light that flashes on or off. It's not like that, right? What does winning mean for Russia at this point, right? Does it mean that every term of their goals of the SMO are met? What does that mean if it leaves a regime in Kiev who will be armed by NATO again and dreams of recovering the territory that they've had to, at some point they may be forced to grudgingly acquiesce as de facto Russian controlled, right? If they get a ceasefire, which is what they want, then they'll just rearm and retrain and maybe send the women in, send the under 18, the 18 to 25-year-olds, despite Ukraine's demographic crisis and the very small number relative that young contingent, simply because since 91, Ukrainians have been living in a permanent state of economic and social and political crisis and haven't had kids, right? And if you suffer large amounts of casualties to that 18 to 25-year demographic, which is why they haven't been forcibly conscripted yet, then essentially you can say that Ukraine has no demographic future, which is equivalent of saying that Ukraine has no future as a state, right? That's why all the reticence. But I believe that Zelensky, the people around him, certainly the government in the US, the governments in Europe, they are absolutely willing to fight to the last Ukraine, if that simply means that Russia is more exhausted or more troubled at whatever end of this conflict is. Does the conflict end at the Dnieper? Does it end in Kiev? Does it end on the Polish border? If Russia reaches the Polish border, does NATO then launch a guerrilla war? Right, with Ukrainians waging, the Banderites waging a guerrilla war out of Poland into Western Ukraine. When does it stop? Where does it stop? Right. I've always said that this conflict will end more like the Syrian conflict ended, right? Than some type of Westphalian treaty or post-World War II settlement. And now, after what's happened in Syria in the last few months, oh my God, do I hope that's not the way. Because Russia and Iran and the Syrian government won the war in 2019 by any stretch of what anyone was saying. Despite the fact that the Turks and Al-Qaeda still occupied North Syria, and the U.S. and the Kurds occupied East Syria, including the wheat and oil fields, right? But Russia secured the Syrian government, right? The majority of the population in the population centers, 2/3 of the country. They cut ceasefire deals then under the Astana framework with Turkey and effectively the same with the U.S. And where did that get Russia a few years later?
Yeah.
So this is the peril of ceasefire agreements and any type of deal with any Western country, whether it's the U.S., whether it's Turkey, the Kiev regime, proxy regime, or whatever. But if this conflict ends like Syria did, wow, that would be very bad. Because I don't know, would that see Donbass and Crimea fall back under Banderite terms in a few years? That, of course, that cannot be allowed. So Russia needs to finish this war now, while they have every advantage, while they have the advantage on the battlefield, while their military-industrial complex is outcompeting the entirety of NATO's military-industrial complex in the type of armaments and ammunition needed for this type of conflict multiple times. They need to finish this now while the West is full of political divisiveness and crisis. With Trump coming to power in the U.S., the German government having lost a no confidence vote, the French government paralyzed, Britain being Britain, and no one could care less about them, right? there's a lot going on right now, and Russia has every advantage. But if they don't see this through to the end now, if they have to fight this war again in 5 years, when Ukraine is rearmed and retrained, when NATO is better prepared and more politically cohesive, that would be very bad for Russia. Russia needs to finish this now. And what does finish this mean? I don't think there can be any deal, any negotiations with the regime in Kiev. I don't believe there could be any negotiations conducted with the United States. One, I don't think the U.S. wants to cut negotiations with Russia. First of all, they want to push the Kiev regime to do it. They don't want to sit down at the table and effectively being signed, agreeing to any type of surrender terms to Russia, right? Europeans certainly aren't in a boat to do this. Who could Russia trust? What would a piece of paper being signed by Zelensky or the head of the Ukrainian Rada or Donald Trump be worth, right? The Minsk agreements, the February 21st agreement, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the joint comprehensive plan of action. What do all of these papers mean? There's absolutely nothing. The Istanbul communique, right? Yeah. There's no reason why. Everyone still thinks that this ends with a negotiation and a sign and some type of framework. What does that mean 4 years down the line when another U.S. president? It doesn't mean anything.
I don't see it.
And I think Putin and the other leader, he's mentioned that before, but I still believe in his heart of hearts, he is a cautious and pragmatic man, and he hopes that this ends with a piece of paper. It doesn't end with a piece of paper. It only ends with regime change in Kiev and probably further than that in Lvov. And even then, it doesn't really end. It just gets knocked down a notch to something less. Yeah. I don't think Ukraine experiences real peace for any significant amount of time. Maybe a frozen conflict, something like that. But that's the best case scenario for the rest of my lifespan. Probably yours too, Danny. It's a lot like Syria now, right? Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All of the hegemon's horses and all of the hegemon's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That is where Ukraine is going to be, unfortunately, probably at the quote end of this conflict, meaning there will be no end, and Syria as well, which will probably be in an even worse situation as the conflict there just moves into a new phase with some new players, some old players. But John Mearsheimer put it best when he said he thought that Russia would win this conflict, whatever winning means, but that it would be an ugly victory. And I haven't heard anyone put it in better terms than that myself. And personally, I'll take an ugly victory. I think it can only be victory at this point, right? It has to be. But this is a truly awful and bloody conflict, and it's, end of it. And
yeah, and earlier, as you were saying, the with regard to Russia and their overall need to secure full victory, it seems like despite there's obvious need for diplomatic face, Russia, Vladimir Putin especially is viewed by many as a moderate, but it does seem overall that just by the terms that they're laying on the table, that full victory, right? It seems like the negotiating terms are, no, we won this conflict, and you're going to have to put, if there's anything on paper, you're going to have to put those things down on it. And there's just absolutely no way that the United States, that NATO, Zelensky as their puppet, would ever sign a paper that says anything of the sort that Russia is putting.
It's not done yet with just these regions. West of Karahava, in the southwest Donbass, Russia is now 5-6 kilometers away from the Dnepropetrovsk region. A new region that Russia of Ukraine hasn't entered into yet in this conflict, but with no fortifications. no major urban areas, no geographical obstacles. All of this years of defensive fortifications built up by the Kiev regime in the Donbass region for, more than a decade are gone now, right? I mean, they're being finished up, the last of them in Pokrovsk and Toretsk right now. And then it's a straight shot all the way to the Dnieper River. And how do you think the West is responding this way just from taking territory back in the Donbass? What are they going to be doing when Russia is racing for the Dnieper River? A lot of things that politically would be viewed as impossible right now may suddenly become impossible with Russia moving to the Dnieper or moving on Kiev or moving on Odessa. I don't even know how that's possible at this point, but it's all of this. And then potential expansions of the conflict into Moldova or Belarus, laterally spreading out, becoming a larger European conflict. Still a lot of ways for this to go south. Don't put too much hope in a quick ending in the next few months on some type of diplomatic terms for this. And I hope I'm wrong. I would be so glad to be wrong on this, as long as it ends on terms favorable to Russia. But I don't think it's going to happen. And I see no real reason other than hope to believe that it will. And you can do hope if you want, but one of my favorite quotes is asking a philosopher about hope. Mm-hmm. And the philosopher replied that hope is a carrot dangled in front of a mule to keep it plodding along. And the questioner says, "Are you saying we shouldn't hope?" And the philosopher says, "I'm saying that we should remove the carrot and walk forward with our eyes open."
Yeah, I mean, we've if the last we're now getting toward year 3 plus in the conflict, and if this period hasn't taught us anything, then about where we are at, then we've had our eyes closed, because what we are seeing is Russia, the U.S., and of course NATO as its battering ram. They are at complete odds. They have antagonistic interests. Russia has a set of interests. The U.S. and NATO has a set of interests, and especially
not
the
only
United
that,
States.
but they're in completely different information universes right now.
Exactly.
And remember that whatever you think you may know about this conflict, and I may know, we don't have intelligence to that regard. Right. But think Western politicians being informed mostly by Western media and how screwed up that will a perception of the conflict, and even how politicized and wrong Western intelligence can be. And we've seen it that way in multiple wars in the past 2 decades.
Yep.
And that is the false information that you are making decisions on war and peace on. That is just the perfect incestuous feedback loop between disinformation, propaganda, war escalation, and everything else going along.
Yeah. And everything that we see on the battlefield, diplomatically, politically, militarily, demonstrates that the United States empire is not going to cease this overall strategic objective, whether there's a strategy behind it or not. But the strategic objective is to destroy Russia. It's not going to stop that just because the Ukraine conflict is not going well for Ukraine and ultimately isn't going well for the United States and NATO. They're going to continue to find other ways. So I think it's important that we do look at this whole map that you just laid out, because there's no doubt. I mean, Belarus has been on the chopping block for a long time. There's no doubt that these moves are going to be made.
Lukashenko keeps crying about it all the time, right? Yeah. They're going to launch a regime change against me. They're going to invade. He says it all the time. And he sounds a bit like, the boy who cried wolf, but eventually he's probably going to be right.
And I had one final topic I wanted to cover with you, Mark, that has been it's just been a very interesting development. So we had the absolute, I'm sure for you, I know both you and I have been covering Syria for years since the regime change war began, launched by the US and its proxies. That collapse of the Syrian government has led to essentially ISIS and its attendant and associated groups taking power in Syria. Now, Mr. Jolani, the top head chopper in chief, we should call him. He's doing the diplomatic thing. He's meeting with Alana Baerbock.
Hey, you will refer to him as Mr. Woke Al Qaeda.
DD Geopolitics, Sarah said, DE ISIS, like DEI, DE ISIS. Yes. But what's so interesting to me, Mark, I want your comment on this. Jolani is definitely not acting like a head chopper politically right now. And I want to comment on this in relation to Russia, because Russia, there's been all kinds of talks about what's going to happen to Russia's military presence, its relationship to Syria after the fall of Bashar al-Assad. Jolani himself is saying, this ISIS head chopper, who literally these forces were fighting Russia in Syria for years, is now saying that Syria and Russia have strategic interests, that this partnership is going to continue or will continue. What do you make of this? And the Russian side is also saying, yeah, no, there's definitely indications that there's not going to be an ejection of Russia from Syria. What do you think about all this? How do you assess this?
Okay, so first of all, as to this Giuliani, or whatever he's calling himself now, this former leader of ISIS in Syria, then the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is Al-Qaeda. All right, Giuliani's mouth is moving, but Erdogan's fist is inserted up his butt, right? And is making, I don't want you to leave, Russians. Please stay in the bases in Syria, right? That is what the real situation is, right? So, and Erdogan made this clear in his first comments after this, where after the fall of the Syrian government, which was clearly, oh yes, the U.S. had their hands in it, and the U.K. and France and Israel, but 90% this was Turkey, right? Yes, why the Kremlin, why the Iranian government ever thought they could ever trust Erdogan any further than they could throw him, I have no idea. I spoke out against the Astana framework when it happened, but we'll let go with that. But Erdogan made a statement that the two longest ruling state leaders of any significance in the world today are me and President Putin. President Putin by a few years older than me. And we've been through a lot through our time. And, Russia and Turkey have so many beneficial economic relations that it would be a shame if something happened to that. And what he was basically saying, when you paraphrase through the statement, what he was saying was, sometimes you win, sometimes I win, but, we've always agreed to separate our geopolitical differences from our economic differences. And I hope you don't take this one too hard. I mean, that's what he's saying. Meanwhile, in the Kremlin, right, they're seething, right? They're yes, Turkey is our friend. And if you watch Russian state media has completely avoided talking about Turkey in relation to the Turkish Al-Qaeda, Turkish-backed Al-Qaeda overthrow of the Syrian government that Russia and Iran had supported. They don't talk about Turkey. Even Putin himself said the largest beneficiary of the fall of the Syrian government is Israel. Well, yeah, in some ways. other than that Neo-Ottoman Empire to your south that just actually took over all that empire. So it seems that for the time being, where Russia is focused on fighting all of NATO in Ukraine, they just have to step back from Syria, from Turkey, and they're going to smile. They're going to continue their economic relationships with Turkey. They'll continue not talking about Turkey in reference to everything going on here. And I'm pretty sure that at the back of their heads, they've got a little revenge is a dish best served cold checkbox that they intend to fill in someday if Erdogan lives that long. But not now. Not here. Not now. Right? There's more important things going on. Now, with regard to the Russian bases there, Erdogan wants those bases to remain there. Why? One, so that relations don't go further south with Russia, right? Obviously, those bases are to a benefit of Russia, right? Not only for power projection into the Middle East, but also for logistics. Not essential, but important to logistics to Russian operations in Africa, in the Sahel, and elsewhere. But also for things that you don't immediately think about: signals intelligence, radar, missile detection threats, right? Russia has lots of facilities for that there as well. So there's a lot to be lost there, something that Russia has had, essentially since the Soviet days. On the other hand, does Russia really want to have that leverage held over them by Al-Qaeda and Turkey? I don't think so. There is some indication that whatever Russia is saying, and they've been saying different things right now, that they are transferring a significant part of their assets in Syria to Libya, which I think is a whole nother mistake and a can of worms myself, but we'll let that go for now. But Russia has also talked about transforming its bases in Syria into humanitarian bases, which is to say, we know that you want our military bases to stay there. We know why you want them there. We don't want to give you that leverage over us. And we don't want to be in the middle of this new three-way Mexican standoff that's going off in between Al-Qaeda and Turkey on one side and Israel on the other, and the U.S. and Kurds on the other. And the Gulf states may want to get back involved at this point because they don't want Turkey exerting too much influence in the region. This will be another mess. The Syrian conflict is not over by any stretch of the imagination. And Erdogan may want the Russians there as some type of hedge against the U.S. and Israel in Syria, right? Just their presence, right? Their bases there. But the Europeans and the U.S. are pushing to get those Russian bases kicked out. I just don't think that in even the medium term that Russia wants to give that leverage to Al-Qaeda, to Salafists, and to the Erdogan, that backs them. I think they will smile. They have far too vivid memories of, say, the frantic and desperate U.S. evacuation from bases in Afghanistan, right? They don't want to end up like that. That's not the way Russia left Afghanistan, right? They left a government that lasted for years after they left. Well, they're not going to leave a government in Damascus, but they can still pull out slowly, carefully, getting all of their things out and with saving face while they do it, which is, I think, what they'll be doing. If they transform these bases into humanitarian bases, remember, Russia's been providing large amounts of wheat to Syria for all these years and other supplies. Then maybe there's the possibility of repurposing them back to a military purpose in years in the future, depending how things go, what happens, what kind of government ends up in charge of Damascus years down the road from now. But I don't think that Russia wants to be put in a situation where, let's say, because of something else, relations with Erdogan and Jelani go south, and 20,000 jihadists come storming Russian bases. That is not something that Russia wants to be in a situation for. They don't even want leverage over them in that way, much less some possible situation like this. And I could be wrong here, but my instinct, and I trust the Kremlin's instinct, is, I actually saw, I can't remember who I saw it now, but they referenced the Russian position in Syria now. They summed it up best with a famous Kenny Rogers song, The Gambler. You got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, know when to run. You never count your money when you're sitting at the table. There'll be time enough for counting when the dealing's done. Now is the time for Russia to walk away, not run, but to walk away from Syria.
Yeah. It's one of these moments, Mark, that perhaps we can end on this note, because obviously when we were talking about the forever war that is evolving from Ukraine between NATO and Russia, also here in West Asia, after what happened in Syria, it is quite clear that even if we control for all the other flashpoints, Syria itself is going to be the subject of what seems to be endless conflict now, because
Russia doesn't want to be a part of that.
Yeah,
forever.
well, what I'm thinking, Mark, is you said you don't hold out hope, and I feel like for a lot of people, when something like this happens, there's kind of a especially for those who are against what the U.S. empire does. There's this dejected feeling like, oh, well, we lost. This is terrible. But then there's almost the opposite effect of, well, the U.S. empire is in great shape now because of what happened in Syria. But how I see it is that there is going to be likely chaos that's not controllable here. Not controllable here.
I forget whether it was a general or an admiral who was talking that the U.S. needs to be ready to kill Turkish troops, another NATO member troops, for the fight in Syria now that will evolve, right? Because Erdogan will never let the U.S. continuation of the Kurds, which he considers his mortal enemy, to just sit there, right? They're going to, it may not be immediate, right? But it is going to simmer. It is going to fester, and eventually it will explode. So, and Erdogan has won this round, right? And he is glorying in his new neo-Ottoman Empire success in Azerbaijan, success here. Syria is more than Turkey can digest geopolitically at this point. It is not going to go well. And I give Russia respect. They fought the good fight that they could fight, but when the Syrian government's own forces sold out or were bribed, co-opted, whatever the situation was, they're like, well, then let's walk away with dignity, toss the cards down on the table. The cards went against us, and Russia can walk away from Syria. They can do it. It's a loss, right? They lose assets, they lose influence, they lose face, but it could be worse, right? Turkey can't so much walk away from Syria, right? The U.S. can't walk away from anything because they never do, because they're the hegemon, right? Or not out until after several decades of it. Russia needs to recognize what its priorities are, and what the limits of what its geopolitical horizons are now. And they can't take their eye off the ball on Ukraine, because at the end of the day, Ukraine is far, far more important geopolitically, socially, and economic, for every stretch of the every possible facet, more than Syria was. But that being said, that's the cold-blooded Russian realist in me, assessing Russia's interests and so forth. But the human being that is deep inside that frozen heart there somewhere is generally in trauma for the religious and ethnic minorities of Syria, the Christian, the Orthodox Christian community, the Alawites, the Shia, the Druze, everyone, except for even there were Kurds on the Russian and Syrian government side too. That not all of them fell under the U.S. umbrella, but I hope, again, hope is not, but I hope and pray that the Russian government does everything possible to help these Syrians escape from what is coming to Russia if they want to, because there must be a place for those people here, because they are ours. They have become a de facto part of the Russian world, right? And in the large sense, not the ethnic sense of that word. And Russia has long been the haven of Greeks from the Byzantine Empire, Armenians, lots of diaspora peoples. And if things go as it almost seems certain they will further south, with an Islamist Salafist regime trying to keep control of Damascus, then, I mean, I've already seen, I'm sure you've seen the dozens and dozens of horrible videos of what's happening to Alawites and so forth. But I really hope the Russian government makes it easy for those. I know they were bringing out Syrian military officials and political officials, but I hope it is in some way extended to the normal people of Syria as well.
Yeah, and for me, the empire, I guess, partisan in me, while I don't necessarily see hope, this is a bad situation, so I don't see hope in the situation. But what I do see is how Russia navigated this, and of course the rest of the multipolar world, Iran being a bigger player too, is that when you see this happening, something you cannot control. This was not something. Russia's foreign policy, people tend to forget, is not to prop up and interfere in the internal affairs of governments. That's not their foreign policy. So it wasn't going to be, if there's going to be forces, whoever they were, I have a hunch that they have something to do with these intelligence agencies from Turkey to the Gulf states to the United States. They were all working on Syria, obviously, over this period of time. It's obvious that these guys put down their guns. They didn't want to fight. If you don't want to fight, and not only did they not want to fight, they embraced the head chopper. So obviously there was a huge shift politically inside of Syria.
They embraced the alternate identities and visas they were almost certainly given in third-party countries.
Exactly.
And the stipends they were given to live on to order their troops to stand down. I would put it that way.
So
I don't think they're going to be sitting in the salons with the head choppers.
No, but they
embraced a different term.
Yeah. Exactly. There was obviously work being done on the inside, and Russia does not participate in that kind of thing. So for me, what I see is that Russia and Iran said, this is it was happening. There was something going afoot inside of Syria's government. And they said, this is a quagmire. If we get involved, we are now external powers fighting external forces who are invading. And that is going to lead to an all-out quagmire that can't be won by anybody.
It's a geopolitical loss from Russia, but a loss that Russia can walk away from. For Iran, This is a lot more serious and a lot more significant and a much bigger L. And all I'm going to say is that the reaction of the new Iranian president over the last year, this reformist who wanted improved relations with the West, Pezeshkian, I think that he is and will continue to be a disaster for both Iranian and multipolar foreign policy.
Yeah, no, we'll have to see, because if that is the case, there's going to be a lot of internal struggle inside of Iran because of, well, there's definitely a big reason why Iran has been, entering and being a much stronger force in the multipolar world.
Raisi, why were you taken from us?
We're gonna see a lot of anger around that, and perhaps that's a good thing, because obviously Iran will need to will need to orient itself toward the multipolar world if it's going to live.
Think of an alternate history timeline where Trump did not successfully assassinate Qasem Soleimani, and Qasem Soleimani was now the president of Iran.
Yeah,
that's a possibility, and we'll never have that possibility now. Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, thank you in a sardonic and deeply embittered and hateful way.
Right. Well, it's certainly going to be an interesting 2025 to come, a bumpy one to come. Anything else you want to say, Mark, before I let you go, about what you see coming next down the pike?
I think I summed it up in my black-pilled best, that I don't necessarily see anything good coming down. We can always hope for something different and better to come out, but I think that I can't really end it on any better note than your previous guest did. I won't see Happy New Year's because I don't see any happiness the year to come.
Right. It will be a bumpy ride. There will be setbacks. There will be losses. I still believe that the overall trajectory is on the same path. It's just we are going to be facing the bumpy part in 2020, the bumpier part in 2025.
Buckle up, true believers. Buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
Mark, it was great to be with you. Definitely have you back on again soon. Have a good night.
Have a good weekend. Thanks, everyone, for enduring my geopolitical soapbox rants.
Take care. Good night, Mark. Talk to you soon.
Good night. Cheers.
All right, everybody, we are going to end quick. I will go over some super chats to end the show. I do want to say that this is one of two streams this weekend, and I want to just let you know that tomorrow I have Andrei Martyanov, Larry Johnson, and Scott Ritter for a mega conversation to continue to kick into what's going to happen here in 2025, what already is happening in 2025. Save the date. That's going to be 6 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. Pacific. Sunday, January 5th. So that is just one day from now. So get ready for that. And it was great to have both Larry Wilkerson and Mark Sleboda on, providing different perspectives in some respect. It is same factual analysis, but different perspectives nonetheless. Of course, you know my perspective here. My perspective is that while we have witnessed major setbacks, while we do see a very bumpy ride ahead for the multipolar world, while there are going to be tragedies, there's going to be losses, there's going to be massive casualties, even as we see in Ukraine and as we see in West Asia. The genocide in Gaza continues. Israel's violations in Lebanon continue. We know that Yemen is losing people as Israel, US, and UK bomb them. But I do believe overall we are still going to see the path toward a multipolar world strengthen and firm up. Because one thing that we did not get to discuss yet today, I want to close with, is that the more that the United States empire lashes out, the more that it attempts to wipe away all that exists, all that is able to build an alternative, it tries to erase something that is unerasable, that cannot be eliminated, and that is resistance. And that is the need for humanity, the utter need. It's not a want. This is a need for humanity to not just exist in the future, but to thrive in the future. And that is something that is shared by many people, most people around the world. That is something that many people see as overall where they want to be in their future. And it's not just a want, it is something that is pushing them, that is starving them, that is threatening them as we speak. So I believe that we are going to see very unpredictable developments emerge in the next year. I don't believe the question of Syria is resolved. I don't believe the question of the axis of resistance is resolved. I do believe Hezbollah still has capabilities. I do believe the Palestinian resistance. Well, it's not even that I believe this. It is that they're saying it and that they're doing it, especially the Palestinian resistance, which continues to take out Israeli forces, fight back in Gaza wherever they can, also in the West Bank and beyond. We are going to continue to see resistance to this. Syria is going to provide a platform from which that resistance could potentially explode because of the chaos, the quagmire that's going to result from this. And unlike Afghanistan, which had already been dismembered, destabilized for so many years prior to the US occupation of 2001, we are seeing a Syria which had been sovereign and independent for many years, which has ultimately millions of people who do not want to see a regime like this. Why do you think that Jolani had to postpone elections for 4 years? Because someone like Jolani could never be elected. Someone like a Turkish proxy could never be elected. People exist in Syria, and I don't just have hope. I have faith and I have the belief that they will resist, because I've seen that not just from Syrian people, but the rest of the region as well. And we are going to see that resistance ultimately take fruit, I believe, in the next year plus. This is not based on hope, in my estimation. It's based on just how history ultimately transpires. When you have something like Russia and Ukraine, when you have a long war like that, it is easy to lose hope. It is easy to get pessimistic because all you see ultimately is death and small gains. But that war of attrition there is ultimately going to be the victory of Russia. There's no way around that. There's nothing that the United States and NATO can do other than wipe away humanity to stop it. So why would then Russia stop its pursuit? Well, it won't. It won't stop pursuing its interests in this conflict unless there is some kind of regime change operation that succeeds, like in Syria. But there is no indication that any such thing exists. This is the last tool in the tool belt of the empire to try to work your way into governments, work your way into societies and nations that you want to overthrow, and try to overthrow them from the inside. They couldn't do it to Syria militarily. They really couldn't. Syria's military did not fight, and they definitely can't do it to Russia, because Russia's military is by far and away it's just an unimaginable force that is stronger than anything Syria could put up. So ultimately, I don't see regime change in Russia happening really ever, and I don't see China falling to that same fate. Iran, there are people who have questions about that. I have the utmost, just given what I've heard and seen about Iran. I see that the people there want a multipolar world, and if their leadership doesn't want it at any point, then that leadership is not going to last very long. So Iran will remain, I believe, a player in this multipolar world. People will have their opinions and their assessments about whether they are doing the right thing as of right now. For me, it seems like that the overall strategic situation is just one that requires a lot of patience, because if you do not have patience with an enemy that is going to do the unthinkable at any moment, at any time, then you will ultimately be falling into their trap. And I don't believe that the multipolar world is going to fall into any traps, whether it's Syria, whether it's Ukraine. There is no traps that especially the bigger powers are willing to fall into. Some might see that as betrayal, for example, with Gaza, for example, with Syria. But it's much more complicated than this, because an all-out military conflict between the forces of multipolarity and unipolarity ultimately leads to the destruction of both, or at least the incredibly arrested development of multipolarity from here on forward. That is the reality of the situation. That is the real politique. That is the realism, so to speak, of the situation. Ideologically, where I'd like to see things go, of course, I'd love to see China, Russia, Iran be more forceful, provide more assistance, get more into the fray. But then again, I think to myself, well, what is that fray? What does that look like? How does the governments and societies, China, Russia, Iran, how do they balance their own needs to develop their economies to protect themselves and their own sovereignty with the assistance they provide others? I believe we've seen a historic expansion of BRICS. We've seen the historic expansion of multipolar, multilateral institutions over the past several years. I don't think that is going to stop. But it is true that there are limitations to how far the multipolar world can go at this point, but there's also limitations for how far the empire can go as well. So we are in this historic juncture where ultimately this confrontation that is inevitable between these two alternative modes of development will lead to something catastrophic. It just so happens that we have forces in the world still, China, Russia, Iran, that do not want to see that happening prematurely, meaning that right now, in the here and now, Iran is not going to sacrifice the lives of millions upon millions, if not really the entire planet, in order to open up a major front against the U.S. empire right now. Some may see that as a weakness. Some may see that as a betrayal. Some may witness what is happening in Gaza, for example, in Syria, as just too much to bear and forces all of us to do more. I agree with that wholeheartedly. However, my beliefs and my ideas in my head do not change reality in and of themselves, meaning that ultimately we can believe and want certain things, but to put those into practice is a whole other story, and ultimately the most important one. So this is why it's important to have and withhold judgments that are overly harsh on the multipolar world in a period of major transition. The confidence that people have in the empire, I believe, is too grand right now in the collective West. Too many believe that the US empire is on the up and up. It is in recovery mode. That is not true at all. The economy of the collective West, the capitalist, monopolist economy, is in complete tatters. The foreign policy of the US-led collective West is in tatters. This constant desire to conduct regime change is literally leading to an empire that's overstretched and unable to actually achieve its objectives. It relies upon covert means. It relies upon dirty wars, hybrid warfare, and sometimes that has success over time. Actually, it took over a decade, if not 15 plus years, to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. You could call that a victory of 15 plus years of covert as well as destructive overt and interventionist foreign policy is a victory, but it comes at a great cost. It comes at a great cost to U.S. society. It comes at a great cost to the ability to manage the empire, where now you have the United States having to compete with its own proxies like Turkey, like Israel. It's going to have to compete with head choppers for influence in the region. It is going to have to manage a situation that is unmanageable, govern a situation that is ungovernable, and that means that there's more losses down the way for the United States. Just look at what happened to Iraq. Look at what happened to Afghanistan. We can go on and on and on about how eventually U.S. foreign policy leads to the opposite of its objectives, but I don't need to belay the point because those two examples are enough. Afghanistan was supposed to be forever defeated. Iraq was supposed to be forever a vassal. Neither is necessarily the case now, and Syria will not be any different. So the U.S. empire will create more destruction. It will continue in 2025 to attempt to dismember any kind of unwanted states that exist still. But ultimately, it will fail. And I believe that failure rests at the doorstep of Russia and China, because those two powers, especially China, but Russia as well, are too big, too disciplined, too important to the overall world situation to fall at a time when they have developed so many mechanisms to protect themselves beyond that which any other country under the gun of US empire has been able to do. We have to stop looking at a country like Syria like it's Russia or like it's China. We have to stop looking at countries that have unfortunately suffered the fate of regime change as equivalent to them, because it's not. The overall trajectory is to get to them by the empire. That's what they want. But it's not anywhere in the near future. But what has to happen now from here is that the forces of resistance, wherever they are, whether in multipolarity, wherever they are, whether in the collective West or elsewhere, need to continue on the path that they have set out. And they're going to have to make, because ultimately you can't be neutral on a moving train. You cannot continue to allow escalations to build up to the point where they're on your doorstep. So difficult decisions are on the way for Russia and China as well. They are going to have to be more forthright, more direct, more involved in these conflicts of the future. There's no doubt about that. And ultimately, I believe that is when we are all, as the human race, are going to have to make a decision. Which side are we on? Do we truly want humanity to continue? Because when that point comes, when there is a direct confrontation between China, Russia, and the US and its vassals on the other side, that is when we have the potential for humanity ending nuclear war igniting. And I have to say that after the events of 2024, we are closer to that than ever. That is 100% true. And no matter what happens in 2025 and beyond, no matter whether we see advances for the axis of resistance or really just the forces of multipolarity in general, or whether we see setbacks, I believe we're going to see a combination of the two. But no matter what happens in that arena on these smaller fronts, ultimately, the big front is what we are here at this channel looking at the most, which is the United States, and whatever imperial vassals will follow its dirty tracks. It's ultimately on the path toward grand war with Russia and China, and that inevitably leads to nuclear war. That inevitably leads to the end of humanity. And that is when we all, at that point, we have no choice but to make very difficult decisions that will affect us all. There will be no live stream genocide. There will be no ability to sit back and just live life when something else is happening abroad. Those days are fast coming to an end. So buckle up, everyone. It's going to be a bumpy 2025. Without further ado, let me get to the super chats. One thing I want to make you aware of is tomorrow, 6 p.m. Eastern, I will be live with Larry Johnson, Andre Martinov, and Scott Ritter for a huge live stream. Huge live stream. We are going to get into the big weeds on so many things as we look forward to 2025, especially on the military front, because the military front is going to shape politics, no doubt, from here on forward and vice versa. With that said, let me get to super chats. I'm sorry I didn't get to ask questions of guests today, but I'm going to get to some of these. Sparky said, don't forget India. Thanks so much for the super chats. I'm only going to do one for each person. If you gave more, I'm going to just tell you thank you so much for giving more. But Sparky, you always give more than one, so I appreciate your contribution. And what I'll say about, let me just say this about India. We can't forget India in some respects when it comes to their importance to multipolarity. But I have to say, similar to Turkey, I don't trust the Indian regime. I don't. I mean, and the big reason for that is India's politics are dominated by an elite that is far more amenable to the U.S. empire than it is to multipolarity. And I believe only the core interests of existential survival right now is keeping India within the realm of multipolarity to any extent. At any point, that could dry up when conditions change, and I just don't trust the Indian leadership at all. Like I just have to put that out there. I don't trust Narendra Modi. I don't. I mean, good job for not going along with sanctions on Russia, but I haven't seen anything else in its involvement with BRICS that makes me, or really in its involvement as a political force in the world, that makes me believe that it has any kind of significant role in multipolarity beyond riding a wave that has to be ridden, which is Russia and China building this alternative, and India needing to latch on to big parts of it in order to existentially survive. And I will put it out to the people of India to please continue on your struggle to ensure that that changes, because indeed, multipolarity is not just a foreign policy, it is deeply connected to how societies ultimately are able to develop. And it is my hope that the people of India ultimately win a development model that is far more favorable than the one we see now, which, despite all of the economic GDP indicators, is a disaster for the ordinary Indian person. Andre, thanks so much. Removing to Central China, no hope in Europe. I didn't know you lived in China. Well, great to see you. Thank you so much. I know the way, I have the antidote. Well, I'm glad you do. Thanks so much for this. Plato's Beard, great analysis from Mark. Thanks, Danny. Thank you for coming. Tex GRN says South Korea is reporting U.S. is provoking war in the peninsula. U.S. wants the South to fight North Korea. Shelling into North over China. We lost our souls. Interesting. I didn't know that there was shelling involved, but this is indeed true. That's a topic I definitely need to cover at some point in the near future. Annex Canada. Oh, Sparky, I already had you, but thank you so much. With the Ukrainians in curse right now, what is preventing them from going to Transnistria for a political win? I think Mark explained this, that might actually happen. Let's see. But for a big political win, all of this is temporary, as Mark alluded to. But Matt List, thanks so much for that. Michael, thanks for becoming a member. A lot of Sparky. Thank you so much for all of your super chat, Sparky. It's always appreciated. Thank you so much, Moag. And then Andre had a question for Colonel Wilkerson. I have not even heard of this theory, but Colonel Wilkerson will be back. Please save your question for another day. Thanks so much. So with all that said, everybody, save the date for tomorrow, 6 p.m. Eastern time, with Scott Ritter, Andre Martinov, and Larry Johnson. We'll be back at 6 p.m. Sunday, January 5th. As you all leave here, be sure to hit the like button, because that is what helps keeps the stream going as we move along. At post live stream, as it becomes a regular video in the replay sphere, as we call it on YouTube. Thanks to everyone on Rumble for coming. I appreciate the community. I appreciate everyone who gave super chats, of course. I want to give a big shout out to the Patreon community. You all keep this work possible. It is really important to support people like myself, if you do have the means, via something like Patreon or Substack, because we don't know what the future holds politically in the United States. We don't know how foreign policy will shape domestic policy in terms of repression of free speech. But we do have examples of people, for example, like Richard Medhurst in the UK, who have lost their livelihoods on YouTube because of politics. And so that could happen at any point to myself, which is why it's important for all of you to, of course, continue to watch the videos as we have that ability. But if you have the means, do give membership to Patreon or Substack in order to ensure that this work can continue regardless of what YouTube does. And I'm sorry to say that platforms like Rockfin and Rumble do not right now provide the revenue streams that allow independent journalists to survive in the sphere that I work in. So I am on those platforms. I appreciate everyone who is here from those platforms, although I have retired Rockfin for a time due to some business I am not really happy about, and I just don't have time to address. So Rockfin, unfortunately, has been suspended by me personally, but I am on Rumble, and I appreciate everyone on Rumble. But unfortunately, just going to Rumble and supporting me there just doesn't do it. So Patreon, Substack, if you're able to, please do subscribe. With all that said, everyone, I appreciate everything today. This was a great live stream. I will be back in just a little over 24 hours to do it again with another great crew. Scott Ritter, Andre Martinov, and Larry Johnson. And one last super chat, it seems. Wasim said, Modi believes sectarianism and they discriminate. Yes, yes, yes. Support Israel and use the USA. Yes, yes, yes. All true. Thank you so much, Wasim, for bringing that up and for the generous super chat. People tend to forget this, but I am not going to let India off the hook as a government and as a regime for its actual practices just because it is a part of BRICS and just because it gives lip service to multipolarity at times. It's about what you do. And right now, I only see in terms of the big powers in the world, because I don't consider India a big power. Sorry to say, this is not to denigrate India and the people of India living in India who are hardworking people doing what they can to survive. I'm talking about the politics of India, dominated by an elite. I have to say that I don't see them as, just like I don't see Turkey as a major global player. I'm sorry, it's not true. I don't care how many little, I don't care if they march into Syria with no resistance. I don't care about that. I mean, I care. It's a tragedy. Syrian government was overthrown. That was disgusting. That is abhorrent. That is a part of this imperialist nightmare that humanity has been terrorized with for now centuries. But am I going to give Turkey credit for something they would never be able to do without the United States' approval? They would never be able to do without the United States' military assistance. They'd never be able to do without decades and decades and decades of U.S. Infiltration. Hell, the United States doesn't even want Erdogan to be a political player. They will eventually. Turkey's politics are not stable. The forces that dominate Erdogan circles, the neo-Ottomans, there is no guarantee that those forces will exist. And the United States has every resource at their disposal to make that happen. Given that, unlike a country that's actually part of the resistance and multipolarity full time, there's a lot more domestic strife inside of Turkey than there is, let's say, Iran, for example. Like, that's just 100% facts. You can't deny. If you want to deny it, you can. If you're so pro-empire, you want to deny it. But I'm just going to say this. Stop giving so much power to actually weak states. The reason why Israel is a strong state is because of the United States. And the only reason it's a strong state because of the United States is because it gets all these weapons, it gets all this support, it's allowed to exist. If the United States didn't want Israel to exist, it wouldn't exist. It wouldn't be allowed to do what it does. The same is true for Turkey. Once Turkey's neo-Ottomanism actually starts to subvert U.S. interests, then you better believe those regime change attempts during Turkey's elections are going to get a lot worse for Turkey. And you know what? Turkey is only important to the United States as long as Turkey listens to the United States, its leadership, its government. This is nothing about the people of Turkey, the Turkish people. So it's everything to do with the leadership. It has everything to do with who they really are. And this isn't even about betrayal. They've been like this. It's been like this. Turkey rides the multipolarity wave because it has to, because it knows that it is too weak to actually join in with the empire. It's not seen as a equal party. The EU will never have it. NATO only has it because of decades of history during the Cold War. But come on, Turkey's not a real NATO country. It's only a NATO country as long as it listens and does the dirty work and paddles for the United States. That's it. It's not a NATO country whenever it does something against that. And it'll be treated as such. And it's not as a state, as a government, as a political force currently constituted. I hope that the Turkish people create a better society for themselves. I really do. I really do. And I believe that's very possible. It's not possible with the Enes Kanter, Gulenis, or whatever they're called. Forget them. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about a real political alternative for the people of Turkey. That's up for them to decide and to fight for. But as it's currently constituted, just give me a break. Do not. Serious analysts will never, ever overestimate the power of a small state. Turkey is not a regional player to a grand extent right now. It literally funded and organized thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands. I mean, I don't even know. We could say millions. I don't know. Hundreds of thousands of these head choppers. Great. That's a great model for asserting global power. That's sarcasm because it's not. You're not going to be a global power by funding, arming, organizing, training, and trying to get head choppers that are aligned with nobody unless you pay them to do your bidding. Turkey has no advantages. It has energy, yes. But truthfully, let's be honest, it has no political or geopolitical advantages that it can assert without the approval expressed or otherwise by the US empire, without concrete material and political support. That's the truth. The same goes for Israel. That's why I think Israel's a pipsqueak, really. Yeah, go ahead. Take those US weapons. Hell, give all of us, everyone in the chat right now, give all of us what the United States gives to Israel. And hell, we could do some damage too. But is that power? Is that really power? Or is that borrowed time? Because I see a colony like Israel as on borrowed time. It is living in existence which has been outdated for many decades, which most people in the world have successfully overthrown, at least nominally, maybe not fully, because of the way that the US empire has reconstituted after the fact, after the independence struggles of the 20th century. But nonetheless, it's on borrowed time. And I agree with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. That borrowed time will eventually just become time's up. That's what's going to happen to Israel. It's only a matter of when, not if. Turkey better watch out because its so-called ambitions still have to run up against the empire. This is the end of, I'm going to say it, and I'm going to end here. We are not in the stage of imperial competition. Historically, that is over. It's over. The U.S. empire will never let another empire compete with it. It will never let another country do that. And what do I mean by empire? I mean a country, a nation that wants to extend its power, wants to project power, wants to super exploit and exploit other territories, other nations, other peoples. It wants to do that and take over the U.S. sphere of influence. So that's why Russia and China are not empires. They're not. They don't want to take over the U.S. sphere of influence. They don't want to become military hegemons and economic hegemons over people. What they want is they want a world order where they can exist and cooperate, and they can both get stronger while other people get stronger as well, while the countries that they do businesses with on all spheres, they get stronger too. That's multipolarity. That means there's no interference. Everyone can exist, and the way you do business, the way you do politics, the way you do military affairs ultimately reinforces that. The United States will never, first of all, the United States does not want that. The United States' main war is against that. But it will also not let a competitor to come back up. Look at what it has done to Europe. Europe used to be that competition for the United States. The United States destroyed that competition. Because at that stage of development, the United States had advantages that Europe didn't. Europe got destroyed in world wars. The United States didn't have to. The United States took advantage of that and became the overseers of Europe. They will never, and when it became the superpower in 1945, after 1945, the United States' ruling elite said, we will never allow. They literally have doctrine after doctrine, Wolfowitz doctrine, etc., that says we will never allow another peer competitor. That includes an empire. Although their main focus is on those unwanted states in the multipolar world. So just remember this. Then this isn't to say that the U.S. is in a strong position because of this. It's not. It is still in decay and decline. But it will use every means at its disposal to ensure that that decay and decline lasts as long as possible with it at the top of the pecking order. In many respects, the U.S. has fallen from the top of that pecking order. China is by far a more stable and more desirable economy to the world. Russia has shown it has military strength that rivals, if not exceeds, that of the United States in many respects, not to mention a population that's willing to defend itself with it. So in just those two areas alone, let alone the U.S.'s own internal contradictions. But that's not to say that the ruling elite in the United States, this foreign policy blob, is not going to use its power, what it has left, to stop so-called competitors. So that's why it's important to note that Turkey's gambit in Syria, Israel's constant move toward a regional war to try to open it up so the United States will fight to the death for it. All of that is, one, not a sign of strength. Two, dependent upon what the United States does. So it's important to ensure that we have that perspective in mind as we move forward, so we see the balance of forces for what they are, rather than what the mainstream media wants us to believe them to be, because it is not as favorable to the empire as what current developments to end 2024 and enter 2025 might seem right now. With all that said, everybody, I gotta go. I really can't stop. It's a big stream today. I appreciate everyone. Do tune in to my live stream tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern time. Scott Ritter, Andrei Martynov, Larry Johnson. With all that said, over and out. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.